weren't able to take all that in, you will find a laminated copy of the detailed instructions on each row. Now, I have been inclined sometimes to speed that up, as they do on Strictly Come Dancing when they have the conditions, etc., and have singing and dancing behind. But I was advised that wouldn't be appropriate. So I've done that properly. I hope everybody understands that. First of all, can we go to procedural items? And are there any declarations of interest? Councillor?
I listened to the discussion. I didn't, I don't have any prejudices to the item. That's the main point I would say.
And you've got an open mind, and that's the important thing, isn't it? Okay, as we all have. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. I don't think that should exclude you from taking part or voting either. So that's the advice that we've been given. So thank you for that. Confirmation of minutes. Believe it or not, the last meeting was the 20th of December, 2023. All those in favour that that was a correct record, please raise your hands. Thank you. And could we have any information regarding substitute members, please, Catherine?
We don't have any substitutes this morning, Chairman. We do have 2 apologies from Councillor Ledger and Councillor Collins.
Thank you. So we have 2 apologies. Thank you very much. We now move on to planning matters. What we usually do, and we're doing this in this particular case, as there are on item 3 2 speakers, they're the only speakers of this morning's session, we thought it was only sensible to bring that item forward and deal with that first, so that we can deal with that item and people can be either stay for the rest of the exciting session or indeed get on with their lives. So we're going to begin with item 3, which I think is page 53 in your report. And the proposal is redevelopment of the site for specialist accommodation. This is land between Wharf Street and Westcliff, the former AXA car park, Westcliff, Lytham. And this is redevelopment of the site for specialist accommodation for the elderly, consisting of up to 18 apartments with care, C2 class, and associated landscaping, access roads, car parking, services and storage buildings. So we have our officer, Matthew Taylor, who's the officer who's going to deal with the presentation. What we usually do is I'll ask Matthew to make a very brief introductory presentation, and then we'll break for the 2 speakers. So if the 2 speakers are here, and I think I've had that confirmed that they are, it won't be long before we ask you to come up to the lectern, and you have 3 minutes, but I'll put you in the safe hands of the Vice Chair, Councillor Harrison, and he will deal with that. So if we're all sitting nicely, we'll begin. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning to members of the committee. So the first item, or item 3 on the agenda, as Councillor Redcliffe mentioned, it's the redevelopment of the former AXA site in Lytham for a development of specialist accommodation for the elderly, consisting of up to 18 apartments. So the site is here, edged in red. Members may recognise this as the site of an existing building called the Sidings, which is operated by the same developer, recently completed. Existing dwellings here on Westcliff, North Wharton Street running to the south, these cottages opposite on Wharf Street. So just to provide some context with an aerial view before we break for the speakers, you've got the Booth supermarket up here to the corner. There is now a separate access between the Sidings and Booths that allows a direct pedestrian link through between those 2 developments. This is out of date now in terms of the aerial photograph, but this development's now completed. I've got some images of that later in the presentation. but it's a split-level building with a 3-storey section at the front, stepping up to a 4-storey section at the back towards the railway line. These are more modern 2-storey dwellings on Westcliff, some older 2-storey properties here in this terrace on Westcliff opposite the site access. The site is allocated for housing in the local plan, and it's actually within the boundary of Lytham Town Centre. This building has recently been demolished under a separate prior approval application for demolition. So that's been demolished along with a former tall boundary wall on that southern boundary. This is a row of 3 Grade 2 listed buildings, numbers 47 to 51 Wharton Street here to the south. So you've got those buildings, 2 dwellings on Birch Street at the back of them, and then outbuildings as well intervening with the site. And this is the edge of the conservation area boundary, so it's some distance away from that particular boundary. So I'll break for the speakers at that point.
Thank you, Matthew. I'll hand over now to the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, members of the public. In line with procedures for all such meetings, each speaker will have 3 minutes to present their case. I will be timing that. I'll give a gentle reminder as you come up towards that, and if necessary, a slightly less gentle one if we're going over. But without further ado, the 2 speakers we have are Deborah Waters and Alex Jones. So first of all, if I may call Deborah Waters. Deborah, if you'd like to come up to the front. When you're ready to begin, if you want to press the left-hand button, that will take you live and in your own time.
I'm giving it Chris. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Not strong enough. Okay, thank you for bringing me up today. I initially objected on this development for many reasons. One would be the impact of the heritage Grade 2 listed houses, although not in the conservation area, still a significant heritage input into the local area. Also, the loss of privacy in my property. Also, the overdevelopment of the land, the community impact in relation to the healthcare, and I noticed the Integrated Care Board mentioned that within their report, and also the change of use. Firstly, when we look at the locality plan, there is no definition of that building on that footprint. It's just a piece of land. So you have no reference to what it means to in the surrounding area, to the north, to the east, to the south, or to the west. So that's my first comment on that locality plan in the agenda. All it is a spare piece of land. There is constant talk about the design in this and how it reflects the existing area. It does not in any way, shape or form. The finishes do, red brick and a slate roof. They certainly do look like that. There are no front gardens. There are no rear gardens. It doesn't look like a cottage. It's a 2-storey dense apartment block built on the back of a lane. You could reference Wharf Street, but Wharf Street in itself has a front door to that as well. So, and also it doesn't look on to any houses that have structures at the back of it. So it will be very cramped. It will be very dense. And the landscape, again, they talk about landscaping. I could probably, you can't see that in that locality plan, but I could actually put that landscaping into 3 of the houses out the back, so it's not sufficient as well. So that is in relation to the design of it. In relation to the overdevelopment, the original design, plan approval in 2013 was for 45 dwellings. This will now make it 83 dwellings. There is no consideration for social housing. How are young people supposed to be buying houses in this area? There is no consideration for maintaining the Lytham as a viable option for people coming in to get jobs and then be within the area of Lytham. So that's the overdevelopment. Loss of privacy is really significant to me. I am not overlooked at all by the new development, the sidelings. Also, there has been no consideration to the south side of this structure in privacy for those houses, especially the 3 Grade 2 listed cottages. There has to the east, there has to the north, and there has to the west, but certainly not for us. We have balconies looking over our structure.
30 seconds.
Thank you. Juliet balconies are nowhere to be seen in North Wharton Street, but then again, it looks very similar to all the houses in North Wharton Street. And finally, in the conclusion, I think really we have to go back to the drawing board to look at the design of this building and the impact on a very back lane that's going to be dominated by a high residential 2-storey apartment block.
Thank you
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Deborah. The next speaker I'd like to call is Alex Jones, who I believe is the agent for the application. Good morning, Alex, and again, three minutes. I think you're already switched on the microphone there, so
You'll give me the 30-second warning.
I'll give you the same warning.
Brilliant. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in support of this application for much needed specialist elderly accommodation. Your planning officer has prepared a detailed report, and I support the conclusions reached that this application should be approved. As mentioned, the site is under consideration as the remainder of a long-standing allocation for housing, and the proposal for 18 retirement apartments with care represents a highly efficient use of land, responding to what the government describes as a critical national need and is equally important on a local level. As the applicant has sought to engage with the council's officers at an early stage via an extensive pre-application process, and the design you see before you is the result of this. It's had officer input at multiple stages and has been deliberately designed to be domestic in scale and respect the development pattern of the area. Residents have raised issues regarding parking. The provision of 13 spaces is more than double the policy requirement set out in the provision of parking in new developments SPD, and is the same as was deemed to be acceptable for the sidings development, which has just been completed. For context, the general manager advises me at the sidings that of the 30 apartments occupied, only 20 have a car, so there's not any need for a one-to-one parking ratio there. We would expect parking to decline as the scheme matures. Turning to amenity, which is clearly a big issue for my fellow speaker today. The proposed design generally respects the adopted interface distances set by the council in the design SPDs. The interface distances are a useful guide, and the case officer confirms that the proposal does not lead to any harm or create any unacceptable relationship, including with the listed properties. This is supported by a heritage statement submitted with the application. Furthermore, the development of the site will markedly improve the current appearance of the site and area. Although not necessarily brought up today, disruption during the construction process has been an issue for other residents that we've spoken to. This is for a much smaller building than the sidings, and the build process will be shorter and less disruptive. We of course have a duty of care to our current residents at the sidings, and should the application be approved, we will hope to submit a construction management plan to manage any disruption and things like that, dust secured by a condition. I'd also like to bring up that it's important to consider the material benefits of this scheme. Although it's only 18 units, it is redeveloping a vacant brownfield site. Thank you. The 18 apartments will make a material contribution to the 5-year land supply. If approved, we will be contributing towards the NHS CCG to expand local facilities, and we will be making a contribution towards public realm enhancements, as well as addressing a critical national or local need. The filed plan clearly states that the population of elderly in Fylde and therefore Lytham will expand rapidly over the coming years, and this application directly addresses that demographic challenge. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you.
And again, perfect time. Thank you, Alex.
Brilliant. Thanks.
On that note, I'll hand back to the chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and thank you to the speakers for your time this morning. We're going to hand back to the officer now. We'll continue with his more detailed presentation.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll try and pick up some of the points that were made in the objections as we go through the presentation, some of the main issues that were raised. So just a bit of background before moving on to the proposal. So this is the completed development at the sidings. I'm referring to this because this application is essentially an extension of the current development. So all the residents on this site will have access to all the facilities within this building, including its garden areas. So it's really a case of looking at them in tandem as one whole, rather than as two isolated parcels of development. So this is the permission that was granted in 2017 application, and lately varied slightly, for 65 apartments with care to provide specialist accommodation for the elderly, a use that falls within Class C2. So there were restrictions as part of that in terms of the eligibility of future occupiers relating to the age, so it's 55s and over, and there has to be an identified care need for those occupiers that's been assessed before they are eligible. So that was secured by a Section 106 agreement, alongside other contributions towards changes to the weighting restrictions and configuration of this junction that have now been implemented, and some public realm enhancements on Clifton Street. There was a contribution of £1,000 per unit towards that. So as I mentioned, this scheme includes a number of communal facilities. So there's a restaurant, there's resident lounges, hair salon, activities and crafts room, a cinema, and then the outdoor gardens here. There's also 52 car parking spaces across this development, and these 10 spaces that were provided for the residents of these properties on Wharf Street. So all these spaces, the parking, the gardens, the facilities will be available to occupiers of the new development. So these are some photographs of the site running through each side. You've got the existing access here onto Westcliff. So this is substantially to be reused, some minor alterations to widen this and introduce a new footway. But this was the former car park access to the AXA site. You've then got the two-storey properties here behind on Westcliff, and then you can see this steps up to 3 stories with the existing sidings development in the background. These are apartments at the Mariners, so the Mariners is split across a mix of 2 and 3 storey, so this is a 3-storey section at the Mariners, and then this is the junction with North Wharton Street. This substation in the foreground is outside the site, so it's not within the red line boundary. So this is directly opposite the access, so you've got existing dwellings here on Westcliff, combination of eras, so you've got these older properties here and then more modern properties further along Westcliff, but the approach is similar in the sense that they have these facing gables to articulate the elevations, good symmetry and rhythm to the openings, and then that's replicated in this more modern development up here, again these facing gables and similar arrangement of windows. So this is the back of 7-23 Westcliff. And then there's a car parking area behind those. So you've got their back gardens backing onto the site. This fence that separates the two. There's a kind of barbed wire mesh fence here inside the site that's to be removed as part of the scheme. This is looking on the southern boundary. So this is looking back towards the properties on Wharton Street. So you've got the 2 cottages here on Birch Street orientated at right angles to the site with that blank elevation there. There's a funeral and wedding car garage here. This is an outbuilding at the back of the listed buildings. And then this is number 6 Wharf Street on the corner. So in terms of listed buildings, this is the frontage. So this is the main front onto Wharton Street. And this is the rear of the buildings as they back onto North Wharton Street. So you've got quite long gardens here up to these outbuildings at the back. Then the highway, and then the application site beyond that. They're slightly elevated in relation to North Wharton Street. These are the cottages opposite. So this is 7-15 Wharf Street, immediately to the west of the site. You can see this access has been reprioritised now. So there's giveaway markings at this point of the junction, new weighting restrictions up to the site access. That's that property on the corner of Wharf Street there, number 6. This is looking back from that junction towards the front of the siding. So you can see this 3-storey section here. These facing gables at the front, this gable on an angle here on a chamfer to address that entrance as you come into the site, and then the 4-storey section at the back. Again, the existing cottages on Wharf Street, the parking that's been introduced as part of the development for those cottages, and then this reprioritisation that's taken place around this junction. This is really just to show the spacing between other dwellings on Wharf Street. So you've got terraced houses built to quite high density up to the back edge of the footway, minimum spacing just over 9 metres between these properties. That then opens up to about 10.9 metres between these. So that's just providing some context in terms of the density of dwellings along Wharf Street and the level of mutual overlooking that you have between these windows. So this is on the Mariners. So this is to the west of the junction, that crossroad junction with Wharf Street. So you've got these 2-storey apartments fronting onto North Wharton Street, and then the back gardens of properties on Wharton Street beyond. Again, with this approach with the gables and different ridge heights. This is within the site. So this is to show where the pedestrian connection would be created. So this is an existing bank of parking spaces along that shared boundary. So effectively that pathway is being relocated to this parking bay. So there isn't any loss of existing parking numbers. It's a case of that pathway being switched around in a different location to provide access through between the two sites. Apologies for the amount of text on the slide, but this is just to deal with issues concerning the principle of development touched on by the applicant in their presentation. So there's a pressing need identified in the local plan for elderly persons housing. So there's different categories of housing that we need to meet need. So we've got kind of family housing, affordable housing, elderly persons housing within different categories. So the local plan identifies that the number of people within Fylde that are 65 and over is predicted to grow by just over 41% between 2011 and 2030. So there needs to be some specific provision made for that age group. Extra care housing falls within use class C2, and there are restrictions to occupation that require future occupiers to be over 55 and have an evidence care need, and that's secured or to be secured as part of a 106 agreement. It's the same model that's followed at the sidings, and the development's effectively an extension of that. So as I mentioned earlier, the two sites really have to be read together rather than in isolation to one another, as future occupiers will have unrestricted access to the shared facilities and gardens within the sidings, and a pedestrian route between them is to be provided to make sure that that access is open at all times. There's an exemption within the local plan where 100% specialist accommodation for the elderly isn't required to make contributions towards affordable housing to incentivise that type of housing to be delivered. And then the site's part of a wider allocation for housing in the local plan. So that's anticipated to deliver 65 homes within that site. That was based on the development of the sidings having been approved at the time that the local plan was adopted. It's not a limit or a cap. And it will still contribute to the council's housing land supply. So important, we aren't losing this site as a housing allocation. It's just delivering a different type of housing on the site, and it is an efficient use of previously developed land within the town centre. It's readily accessible to public transport, and new pedestrian connections will provide the closest walking route to bus stops, shops and services. It readily accords with the development strategy. It's a brownfield site within the settlement, within a key service centre and a strategic location for development. So it meets the locational requirements for developments involving specialist accommodation for the elderly, and will complete the redevelopment of the allocated site. So this is the layout. So the buildings, or the site, narrows towards the east. So the intention has been to put the building to the western part of the site, the widest part of the site, particularly to provide a buffer with the rear of these properties on West Cliff, so that the open areas, the car park is located on the east side and the building is located on the west. So the access into the site will reuse the former AXA car park access coming in from West Cliff, opening into this 13-space car park. This is a single-storey building that's a mobility scooter, cycle and bin store. There's a new footpath to be introduced along the southern side so that that's segregated from the vehicle traffic up to the building's main entrance here on the east. This pathway, so there's a 1.5 metre wide pathway around the perimeter of the building to give residents access, and then a separate gated access here onto the junction with Wharf Street. The closest bus stops are down here on Wharton Street. This is the pedestrian access that I mentioned through the car park of the sidings. into the shared facilities of the existing building. Again, there's no loss of parking there. And then the building footprint narrows as you move from west to east. There's this kind of planting border around the edge with some seating on the southern side, and this new hedge and tree planting along the site boundaries. The boundary treatments, so the existing fencing that's here and here along the site will be removed and replaced with a lower level wall to match in with the height of this existing entrance wall into the sidings. And then this is a combination of brick piers and metal railings along here and here to create the new boundaries. So these are the elevations. It's a 2-storey building, and it's really intended to replicate the design of the sidings on a smaller scale. So we've got this corner feature to address that crossroad junction with Wharf Street. Again, these facing gables that you see various surrounding houses in the area that we've seen in the photographs earlier. And the intention is to have these split level roofs, quite similar to what happened at the Mariners, so that the building steps down gradually and that you get breaks in the roof height with these links that are set back from the facade, so that you don't just have one mass of roof running across the whole of the building. So it's there to step down and to try and replicate those more domestic proportions of the surrounding buildings. Again, with the window openings, good legibility to the elevations, good symmetry and rhythm. All the windows are aligned, very similar to the surrounding terrace houses and the pattern of windows on those buildings. This is the single-storey outbuilding here. You can see it's got a very shallow, low hip roof. That's to reduce the impact on the properties on Westcliff. These windows are to be obscurely glazed, and this is a privacy screen, an obscurely glazed privacy screen to this balcony to prevent any overlooking towards Westcliff, and then a Juliet balcony here, and the protruding balconies are more limited looking back towards the sidings, and this one here on the east side facing the car park. And this is the entrance onto Wharf Street. Again, good active elevations onto the street as you enter into the sidings, and then this corner turning feature to address the junction. So these are some visuals. So this is the crossroad junction of North Wharton Street with Wharf Street. So point 1 on this plan here. You can see the 3-storey existing sidings building in the background. This is the view onto North Wharton Street, so this boundary treatment that I mentioned with the hedge behind, then the 2-storey scale onto that road. And then this is looking back from the sidings through the car park. You can see that pedestrian link through there towards the proposed building. So in terms of amenity impacts and privacy distances, I've marked on the main spacing distances that are referred to in the officer's report on the layout plan. So you've got 24 metres with the existing development at the sidings. Properties on Westcliff are a significant distance away, separated by the car park. In terms of the properties to the south, so these are dwellings on Birch Street, and then those outbuildings in the back of properties on Wharton Street. So you've got minimum just over 10.5 metres spacing distances between the windows and those garden areas, which accords with the standard in the SPD. In terms of the outlook onto this property on Wharf Street, number 6, you've got a distance of 14 metres, but that is over an oblique angle. The actual front-on views from that balcony there look past the dwelling and onto the crossroad junction, and then you've got 19 metres between these elevations with properties on Wharf Street, which is 2 metres below the 21-metre guideline in the SPD. But as we saw from the earlier photograph, it's much more than the levels of mutual overlooking that already exist further along Wharf Street, where you've got distances which are much far further below that 19 metres that's achieved here. So you have got Juliet balconies along this southern elevation, but they don't have protruding platforms, so you can't sit out from those balconies. It's very similar to having a window in those elevations. Those privacy distances are met in accordance with the standard in the SPD. The protruding balconies There's 3 on this northern elevation and 1 on this eastern elevation to avoid any potential for overlooking towards these properties here. So we've got the obscurely glazed windows and the privacy screen on the balcony because of this relationship here. So that distance to accord with the SPD should be the same as this. It should be 10.5 metres because it isn't. Effectively, that elevation has to be turned into a non-habitable elevation. So that's the reason for obscuring these windows, fixing the openings and including the privacy screen on the north side of this balcony so that you can't obtain views from habitable windows into the rear gardens of these properties. So just to summarise some of the points that I've made, the site's a brownfield site allocated for housing in the local plan. It's an accessible location within the town centre, within the settlement boundary, a key service centre and strategic location for development, and where the majority of development is to be directed towards. So it's a suitable location for the type of accommodation that's being provided. There's a pressing need for elderly persons housing identified in the local plan, and the development will contribute generally to our housing land supply and secure the site's fuller redevelopment. So there's a strong sense of symmetry and active frontages to the buildings. I mentioned those gables and the domestic proportions and the intention that that has to replicate those features on surrounding buildings, at the Mariners on Westcliff, to integrate it into its surroundings. It's limited to 2-storey scale to follow the prevailing storey heights of surrounding dwellings. It is a taller building, that's necessitated because of its footprint. It's got a much deeper footprint, so you need a taller roof. But there aren't any stark differences in height with the surrounding buildings that would result in it being unduly oppressive or overwhelm them. I mentioned the split level massing across the roof. So there's a series of steps to the roof. It hips back away from the roadside with those lower linkages breaking up its massing. In terms of the listed buildings, the description from the list entries in the officer report, that refers specifically to the elevational detailing, to the front and rear elevation of those buildings. It doesn't refer to the curtilage building at the back, which is a much plainer building, and you've got a minimum spacing of 40 metres between the closest part of these listed buildings and the proposal. There's also intervening land uses, so you've got intervening buildings, gardens, and those outbuildings, which gives North Wharton Street more of a back street context, and the development's separation and the presence of those intervening uses ensures that there wouldn't be any harmful effects on the significance of the listed buildings. We referred to the separation distances with surrounding dwellings, and they're either met or there are mitigating factors within what is a high density urban setting already, where there's quite high levels of mutual overlooking that wouldn't be prejudiced as a result of this development. The mitigating circumstances for the obscure glazing, the privacy screening to the balcony prevents any adverse effects through overlooking to those properties on Westcliff. In terms of highways, there's no objections from the local highway authority. Limited off-site works required to create a new crossing over the junction of the new access along Westcliff and to resurface part of the footway to the south side of that access up to the junction with North Wharton Street. The level of parking provision, so it's 62% provision, that exceeds the standard in the SPD. So specialist accommodation for the elderly in high accessibility areas is 1 space per 3 dwellings in the SPD. So the 13 parking spaces provided by this development exceeds that by 7 spaces. There's also the availability of the parking at the sidings towards future development, so there's no restriction on the communal use of those areas. And the applicants undertaking parking surveys at other site, the details of that are in the report, that shows that car ownership levels range from between 50% to 88% of total parking provision at each of their sites, which leaves residual capacity for staff and visitors. In terms of the level of traffic generation, again, this is based on studies at existing sites. So this is accepted by the Highway Authority as being representative. So there's a peak of 4 two-way vehicle trips an hour, and the peak period is different to normal residential development because there's no commuting, there's no school drop-off and pick-up, so it peaks between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. So very low levels of traffic generation. In terms of ecology, because the site's starting from a very low baseline, it's effectively an area of hard standing with very limited existing planting. There is one existing tree and some coniferous planting on the eastern boundary, but because it's such a low baseline, the landscaping that's being introduced as part of the development results in a 53% uplift in habitat units and 874% uplift in hedgerow units against the pre-development benchmark. So when we talk about biodiversity net gain, the mandatory 10% that will come in February is significantly exceeded. There's no likely significant effects on the Ribble Estuary site of special scientific interest and no harmful site-specific ecological impacts, in particular the existing building that's been demolished didn't include any bat roosts, and that was proven through surveys. In terms of contributions, as I mentioned, there's an exemption in policy H2 for 100% specialist accommodation for the elderly, where no affordable housing contributions are required. So the restrictions on occupier eligibility by age and care need are to be secured as part of Section 106 agreement, as are contributions towards public realm improvements on Clifton Street, commensurate with what was secured at the siding, so £1,000 a dwelling. And the Integrated Care Board have requested a contribution of just over £9,300 towards improving infrastructure at Holland House Surgery. And there's also a monitoring fee for the council's costs in monitoring those, or collection of those contributions. Sites in flood zone 1, so it's at the lowest risk for flooding. Drainage strategy has been provided up front with the application at the request of the lead local flood authority, and they have no objections to that strategy. In terms of contamination, there are some legacy uses that have left contamination on the site, so that's to be excavated and transported off the site, and a new cover system of clean soil will be brought on in landscape areas to ensure that there is no harmful effects as a result of the remediation works that's carried out and has been approved by our Environmental Protection Service. So with all that in mind, the resolution is to delegate the decision to the head of planning to grant permission subject to the completion of the 106 agreement to secure these contributions.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We now move to a time when I invite members to ask questions and indeed debate the recommendations. Councillor Farrington, and then Councillor Armitt.
Thank you, Chair. I think I just would like to establish a starting point, because one comment I heard was that this should be seen as one development. When you look at it dryly on a piece of paper, that seems to make sense, but we live in the real world. Funnily enough, today's weather is indicative of my point. And having an elderly mother in a similar type of development in North Leeds, I can tell you categorically that the majority of residents, once they become established in an age, will find just a small trek across open ground in this type of weather onerous and won't do it. My mum will only go to another side of a complex because it's undercover, and that is sometimes with help. And I think, as was pointed out on the car situation, when people move in, that there might be a younger profile, but over time, with the ageing and the infirmities that develop, what you'll find a decade down the line is that the two parts of the development become disparate, and the facilities of the original development will mostly not be accessed, in my opinion and experience, looking at my family experience in, and I used to be a director of a right to manage in North Leeds as well, and I do have some experience on that. So just from a starting point premise, when we're discussing do we need such a development and the benefits that accrue from having that there, I would just argue against the initial premise that it is part of another development, because I would see the two as entirely separate. And that's irrespective of other points that we're going to discuss. But I just wanted to put that out there to begin with, Chair. Thank you.
I believe Councillor Evans was next, then Councillor Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Matthew, for a detailed report. I've got some sympathies, and I agree with Councillor Farrington's observations there. I've got some sympathies with local resident Deborah. I can see that from the responses that the majority are against, although we have a late observation coming in from existing residents of the sidings to say that quite a few of those are in favour. So it's encouraging to know that the people who are already residential in that unit find it a nice place to live. It's difficult to argue that this isn't high density accommodation. You know, any of us that drive up and down that road, and I use it as a quicker route into Lytham quite often, especially in the summer, that area has been developed massively, but it's very difficult for me to find a reason to go against based on what's gone before. My main concern is, again, following on from Councillor Farrington, that we're establishing that this is for over 55s, elderly accommodation and people with specific care needs. I'm assuming that the care is not provided by the actual unit itself, so that care is going to come in the form of carers visiting in the mornings and in the evening, helping people to get dressed, helping people to go to bed, etc. So while the people residential may not need car parking spaces, those carers most definitely do. And I'm not sure realistically that that's been taken into account. Obviously, the developer wants to maximise the return on the site, but I am sympathetic to local residents that feel that the area has been overdeveloped. And I'd like some lead from Matthew as to what happens for those carers when they turn up in the morning and in the evening to help people. Thank you.
Matthew, would you like to respond to that? Thank you.
So it's my understanding that carers will be provided from an external provider, basically. So they aren't based within the site; they do come from the outside. What the applicant has said is that most of those carers are local, that they do operate kind of green travel schemes, car sharing, etc. Obviously, we're in the town centre here where there is good access to other transport modes. In terms of the level of parking, the SPD includes, or the standard in the SPD includes an expectation that some staff are going to visit the site in addition to residents. So that's kind of intrinsic within that standard. So the level of parking, as I've mentioned in the presentation, is more than double what we say in the SPD is required for this type of development. So it would be very, very difficult indeed to justify further parking on that basis. We've set a standard that we expect to be complied with, and it's been quite significantly exceeded. In this case, you do have some limited off-street parking available on surrounding streets, particularly Westcliff, but you've also got the use of the 52 parking spaces at the sidings. And it's obviously there's no objections from the Highway Authority to the level of parking. So really, when you look at everything in combination, the accessibility of the site where it is in relation to public transport, it's not a site that's very remote. It is within quite a densely built up urban area. And as I mentioned, actually within the town centre boundary, it's definitely a site where this level of parking is acceptable.
Councillor Armitt now to come in, please.
Thanks, Richard. I'll always have an emotional attachment to this site because I was there when we took out the swimming pool and the squash courts and the beautiful spa facilities and destroyed the sports centre to build a IT centre there, and then we turned that into a print centre afterwards. So this road has often had huge lorries going up and down it delivering paper stores, and it was our GRE just before it was AXA. Stores. We had massive lorries. It was always difficult to access down to Westcliff, but we had massive lorries going up and down there all the time. But while barbed wire fence is taken out, I'm probably responsible for installing that. It's good to see that it's developed because it stayed empty for a very long time. It was, when we had it, it was quite ugly, to be honest. It was never a beautiful building. It was just a literal working warehouse storage area. So it's good that that has been changed into something really useful, practical and needed. And in that way, I'm happy to support what we've got here because I can't find planning reasons to object to it. I can see what's being said, but not planning reasons. I've got two questions though, Matthew. One's just, I think, probably a typo. On page 56, you've got 18 apartments, 8 1-bed, 10 2-bed and 2 3-bed. So is it 18 or 20 is the first question, and what's the split on that? And when we've got 2 beds and 3 beds, that 18 apartments then goes up to quite significant numbers above 18 people. So it's a great con to say six cars for 18 apartments, but then you've got 2 and 3 beds in there, so you're way above 18 in there. So it would be better to have it to usable people rather than apartments, because we know from round file that most people run 2 cars per apartment minimum. So I'm still recovering from the shock that this 55, you referred to me as elderly or more. Apparently I'm elderly, and I'm struggling with that emotionally. And that struggle might qualify me for getting a place. But the other thing on it, that more seriously, if this is for people who've already been assessed as having a need, and you're looking at 18 apartments with multiple bedrooms, so probably 30 odd people, what does £8,000 touching a GP need in a place like Lytham? We're already struggling with GP requirements. Vic is already struggling with hundreds and hundreds of months of waiting lists going on up there. What's the realistic position of taking 30 odd plus people with requirements new to the town into medical support with £8,000? I just don't see that as being a realistic or sensible figure. I'm sure you'll say it's in the regs and therefore it's okay, but that doesn't help. That's not realistic.
I suspect it'll be a formulaic answer to that in terms of formula, etc. But I'm going to bring the officer in. I'll get some clarity on that, Councillor Armitt. Matthew?
Yeah, just to clarify both points, yes, it is a typo in the report, so that should be 6 1-beds instead of 8 1-beds. So that's where the mistake is. In terms of the GP practices, again, the first thing to note is that the contribution has to be spent on infrastructure. So buildings, extensions, or in this case, reconfiguration of the GP practice. You can't collect contributions towards employing new staff, revenue. There's quite a recent case law against that. So it can only be spent on infrastructure projects. And the Integrated Care Board has their own formula, very similar to what LCC do in terms of education, in terms of working out the likely number of new patient registrations and then relating the contribution back to that. So that's the ICB's methodology rather than our methodology. So it is based on that formulaic approach. But yeah, it's important to note that it can only be spent on infrastructure rather than staff.
Councillor Armitt, I think I'm going to allow you the option.
I've got to come back on that. This very council reckoned it needed £32,000 to put a window and a bit of electricity in a hut across the beach here. So it's £32,000 to put a window in and a bit of electric to an existing building. £8,000 to local GPs. Light bulbs? I mean, what realistically, when you're looking at 30 people with medical needs coming to our town, new to our town, and how do we manage and where do we find the space to do this extra building on which GP? And how do we manage that 8,000 to see that it is spent on that? What's our responsibility for delivery on that, please?
So the money that we collect from those contributions is given to the ICB. So it can't be collected by the ICB, it's got to be collected by us because the ICB aren't a local planning authority, so you can only the local planning authority can collect the contribution. So effectively we collect that and then pass that on to the ICB. They have to identify a specific project where that money will be spent. And that's effectively down to them, similarly to the contribution that's been requested. So we don't have any specific influence over where they spend that money. They're spending that money where they think it is best or most needed or best used for their purposes. But again, it's, you know, this contribution has come from the ICB directly. This isn't anything that's within our policy. It's within their methodology for how they calculate these proportionate contributions. I suppose the other thing to note is that it is a fairly recent addition in terms of these contributions towards primary care. It's something that's only come in the last couple of years, so that there was a time when we wouldn't have been getting any such contribution. So there is at least an uplift in that respect compared to the situation in the past.
Before Councillor Farrington comes back, I'm just bringing the Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chairman. Just before we go too much further down this statistical rabbit hole that we seem to be going towards, first and foremost, these aren't people who were suddenly created from nowhere and beamed down into our town. In most cases, I think people move locally into more managed accommodation as they get older. A lot of them may well be using these health services already. I just think, I completely understand where you're coming from, Councillor Armitt, but I think we need to keep it in a sense of proportion.
Okay. Councillor Farrington.
Thank you. I've got a couple of new points, but I just want to pick up on a previous one to begin with. It was mentioned that there's some kind of coordination of care provision locally. That suggests that the management team are providing care packages within the rentals. Could you tell me if that's the case? Because I don't think it is, but if it isn't the case, then there won't be any collusion, and each individual will be responsible for their own care provision. And as their care deteriorates, they'll definitely have different individual carers coming in at different times of the day. There won't be some coordinated approach to that. I think we should just dispel that myth. So moving away from that, and about the care packages, and that relates to car parking. Going in terms of the look of the actual building from the plans, I have some concerns about the look of the development. It was mentioned by Matthew that, you know, it doesn't look oppressive. I think that's a subjective view, because looking at the plans, the roofs are very tall and they slope down, in my term, quite oppressively over local buildings, and particularly the cottages and the buildings along North Wharton Street. You've mentioned there that the gap between the two is just near to the minimum standards, but below. But it is below. That's a fact, isn't it, in terms of planning? Another point I'd make about the structures is that, well, I'd ask why Juliet balconies. By definition, a balcony is there for somebody to stand at and enjoy a view. I think we can all agree on that. I mean, ergo, are we expecting people not to stand at their balconies and affect the privacy that was raised by the first speaker, Deborah Waters, that it does definitely impinge on the privacy of locals because, as I say, a fact is a balcony is there to stand out and look out of. If that isn't the case, then why build them in the first place? So, you know, I've got that issue there that I wonder if, you know, what the response would be to that. The other thing I want to raise is a new point, actually, which is about the building impacts, because I understand from the initial development is that there was heavy piling and drilling that affected and cracked some of the buildings around the development. And I will say that the builders themselves have had a very unhelpful approach to the residents and have made some quite big promises at the beginning, which haven't come to fruition in terms of recompense for damage and cleaning and the dust that resulted from the building. And I just wondered whether we could add anything into this proposal, if anything is passed. And again, I'm not going to prejudice any votes here, but if anything is passed that protects the residents from that as well. I don't think within 3 minutes that the resident speaker had enough time to really talk about that. But I know that talking to Councillor Bamford, who lives opposite, that it was a major problem. You know, I'd like to hear if we can do anything about that. I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you.
All right, thank you for those points and significant points. Matthew, would you like to address those? Thank you.
I'll address each of the points raised individually. So the first issue was about the coordinated approach to care packages. So the way that this has worked at the sidings and the way it functions in the 106 is that there is a single care provider who basically employs the carers to come into the site. So it isn't a case of individuals employing their own individual carers and they kind of turn up at various different times. There is one care provider, certainly that's mentioned in the planning obligation for the sidings, that then is a company effectively, and they employ a number of carers who come to the site and provide the care for the individuals. So it is more coordinated in that respect than in each individual employing their own carers. In terms of the roof heights, as I mentioned in the presentation, it is something where the building has a taller roof because it's got a deeper footprint. So as a result, you have to have a taller roof to get the minimum pitch than you would, for example, these are properties on Wharf Street here. There is a maximum difference of 2.7 metres between the ridge height of this building. So that's the tallest ridge height, which is this, that's at the rear of the site. So this is the frontage, and then it steps up slightly towards the rear. So between that ridge height and the lowest building that's on North Wharton Street, there is a difference of 2.7 metres between those, which isn't particularly large in terms of resulting in a mismatch in height or something being particularly overpressive or overpowering in relation to surrounding buildings. The properties, you've got the cottages on Wharf Street that are quite squat buildings by nature of their era and the construction. You've got taller buildings on North Wharton Street. So, for example, you've got the property here on the corner at number 6 Wharf Street, which is a taller building profile in comparison because it's a more modern construction. You can then see, so this is the 3-storey gable at the siding, so it's not actually the top of the roof, it's those facing gables that are set down from the ridge. So the ridge is much higher behind, so there's a 3 metre level difference between the ridge or the 3-storey ridge of that building and the top ridge height of this building, so it is stepping down. And obviously it's limited to 2 stories to try and replicate the height of those surrounding buildings. So that's really the rationale behind it, and to break up this roof, as I mentioned, with these links that are set down in relation to that roof. So these are narrower parts of the building where the roof can be set down. In terms of spacing distances, again, something I mentioned in the presentation. So this is the distance towards properties on, these are properties on Birch Street here. So these are the closest neighbouring gardens. The properties on Wharton Street, the listed buildings are much further back there. So there's a 40-metre spacing with the actual buildings themselves. And then these are the backs of their gardens with the outbuildings. So the spacing here comes from the guidance in the SPD, which talks about that 10.5-metre distance. So, for example, if you had houses that back onto one another, you'd want your first floor window, then a 10.5-metre deep garden to provide a buffer, effectively, in terms of overlooking, so that you're not directly looking into those gardens. So this arrangement meets that standard. In terms of the Juliet balcony, I think that the key is that, or the way it differs from a protruding balcony, yes, you could stand at the window, yes, you can open the doors, but you could do the same from another window opening. It doesn't allow you to step out, so there's a balustrade that prevents you from any stepping out onto a terrace. So it isn't, in planning terms, it isn't any different than a window, because you don't have that ability to step out, sit out there, and you don't get those extra views that you would if you were able to do that. So that's really the difference between the two types of balcony. The final thing mentioned was the damage caused to neighbouring properties from piling on the previous scheme, and whether we can have any kind of role in that. It isn't something that we can become involved with in terms of liability or compensation or things like that. Those are purely civil matters between adjoining landowners, so the council doesn't have a role in mediating or kind of overseeing any type of issues to do with those matters. What we have got is the construction method statement that talks about how the development's going to take place, where contractors are going to park. You can put up vibration monitoring devices, you can kind of monitor noise, the timing of construction operations, how vehicles are going to access the site. So all those types of things that are intended to limit the amount of disruption. Obviously, as the applicant mentioned, they've got their own occupiers at the sidings as well to think about. But it's really limited to mitigating. There is going to be some disturbance. It's inevitable. Because you can't build a new development around existing buildings without causing some disturbance, but it is temporary. And the idea is how to limit that to the lowest possible amount, rather than you can't prevent it. But yes, we certainly can't get involved, and we don't have any role in civil matters and pursuing damages and that type of thing. That is purely a legal issue between the adjoining landowners. That's set out quite clearly in the planning guidance.
I'm going to bring Councillor Evans, then Councillor Settle, and then Councillor Farrington back in.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Matthew, for clarifying the carer. That puts my mind at rest to a certain extent, because obviously they will organise, presumably the same people, to put a team in to work through there. And I think, you know, it's the final piece of a jigsaw in that area of development, realistically. And I take on board fully Councillor Farrington's points about trying to stress to minimise the disruption of this ongoing building work. But, you know, I don't really think there's an awful lot of leeway that we've got as a committee to go against what's been recommended, and the officers have worked to clarify as many details as possible. So on that basis, I'm happy to propose.
Could I just clarify? I wasn't sure whether Councillor Ahmed initially had you didn't propose, so Councillor Evans has proposed. Do we have a seconder for that? We'll continue with the debate. We do have a seconder. I'm going to bring Councillor Settle in now, and then Councillor Farrington.
Thank you, Chairman. When I saw the original plan in the agenda, it did worry me, because it sort of overdeveloped. When now seeing the new plan there, I see the right-hand side of it. I mean, that's the eastern one. Is the car parking spaces. So the overlooking from Westcliff seems a lot less to me now. So I'm very happy with the actual proposal now. I guess the other point is that if they weren't to build this accommodation, the developer, I imagine, could easily put another application in for affordable housing, because it's a housing area, and that could actually be of a larger size, because you could easily put a request in for the houses to go up to the eastern side and overlooking Westcliff even more. So as it's for housing, I don't know what the planning rules are, but that could easily be passed. So if this is the alternative, I'm quite happy with it. There's one other, minor point, going back to Councillor Farrington's comment about the walkway back to the sidings. I don't know if it's practical, but you could easily put one of these covered walkways like you have at the airports there, with the glass roof. That helps a bit in cold weather. I don't know whether the developer would consider that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Setter. I think Councillor Farrington wanted to come in.
Yeah, thank you. I just, if I didn't understand some of the history here, I probably wouldn't be as worried, but we're talking about a developer that has, to use the phrase, has form, has previous. And the fact that there's now already ongoing issues with many residents around that area based on the initial development that wasn't immediately on their doorstep, that was up the road, but it caused so much damage to properties and disruption and dust, and that there were false promises made that haven't been either enforced, which I'll come back to in a minute, or actually put right, because obviously they're trying to save money. So coming back to the enforcement point, Matthew makes a point that the council doesn't really have a role in that. It's a civil matter. But I just was going to say, who does enforce those conditions? You mentioned a list of conditions to mitigate impact during the build process, but how is that enforced, please? So that's one question I've got. I'll just come back to the density issue that keeps bobbing up in various comments. Another point of the development is the amount of privacy glass that's having to be installed. Now, if that isn't indicative of a poor design, I don't know what is, really. The fact that so many, the proximity of so many sides means that there's additional privacy glass added is worrying. And actually, just a little bit of history and knowledge for everyone around here is that the initial idea was and the previous builder was going to put houses there, but they backed out because the financials didn't work out, and I believe the financials didn't work out because of the pollution issue, the chemicals that are going to be removed, which brings me on to another point, actually. I understand these chemicals are very dangerous. They are situated or located where the car park is. And I would just like to understand, because there is a concern, and I don't know if it's valid or not, that the reason they're not actually building where the car parks are is because under the car parks is where the majority of the pollution is. So if there is going to be removal, what measures are in place to make sure it's safe removal? And I wouldn't mind a more transparent and open understanding of exactly what is there that's dangerous and how it's going to be dealt with, please. Okay.
Thank you for those questions, and your earlier questions as well. It's really important that we raise issues that on reflection, in terms of looking at the report and hearing what we've heard this morning, is to raise these in this forum. So I thank you for that. And I'm going to bring Matthew in to respond, because that's part of the duty of this committee, that we hear some of these responses and factor those into our own judgments. Matthew.
Yeah. So the first question was about who enforces conditions. So just to clarify this, the council does enforce planning conditions. The point I was making earlier was that you can't require damages to be rectified, civil damages to be rectified through a planning condition. So we can enforce the compliance with the construction method statement that talks about how the development's going to be done. But what that can't include is paying compensation, for example, to residents or rectifying damage to those properties, because those are civil matters that sit outside the planning system. So there's a distinction there between the construction method statement, how the development's carried out, and then the civil side of it that we can't get involved in, but we can get involved in compliance with the construction method statement. So obviously our enforcement team works on the basis of complaints from residents, similarly to our environmental protection team if the complaint was about noise. In terms of obscured glazing, that is very limited to the building as a whole. There's 2 windows here within this single apartment, and then they've got a separate opening to this same room within that apartment on to the east side, where there's a privacy screen along a balcony there. So installing obscure glazing and putting balcony privacy screens up are very common practices that you find on particularly a lot of kind of house extensions and things like that, to limit opportunities for overlooking. So the amenity of this occupier wouldn't be impacted because they've still got the outlook from the balcony to the east side. So it's not as though they're relying on just obscured windows for their outlook. They've got the outlook from the balcony there. Obviously, you've got the extra light from these 2 windows. So the purpose of obscuring those 2 is simply to prevent any direct overlooking from this room internally towards the gardens of those properties because of the limited spacing distance. So it's effectively removing the habitable room windows or any outlook from those habitable room windows towards those gardens. So that's the purpose of obscurely glazing those 2 windows and putting that screen up along that balcony. In terms of the contamination, I've summarised what's in the applicant's report. So they've done a series of investigations, including kind of boreholes and trial pits, and kind of sending those samples off for laboratory analysis. I can't kind of profess to understand the science behind it and the types of chemicals that have been found. Obviously, I've tried to summarise that in the report as much as I can, just by picking out parts of that report, and obviously we passed that on to colleagues in environmental protection who would look at those types of strategies. So, but essentially what the applicant is proposing to do is to, as part of the remediation of the site, they would excavate the ground. So they excavate down to a certain depth to remove the contamination that's been found. They then sample that to make sure that it has been removed successfully, and then they backfill that with clean soil, particularly in the landscaped areas, and then they'll put effectively a gas-proof barrier down around the building footprint to prevent any kind of ingress of ground gas into the building. So if it is kind of crudely the land's excavated, the contamination's removed, taken off the site to a licensed disposal place, and then it's backfilled with the clean topsoil to create this cover system to prevent any kind of linkage between any contamination in the ground and the topsoil and where your plants are growing and that type of thing. So that's a pretty kind of standard way of dealing with remediation on brownfield sites that we encounter frequently. So without being able to tell you the science behind it, that's very crudely kind of what happens in terms of remediation of contamination.
Just to emphasise that what we're going through here is a fairly sort of detailed scrutiny of this application, and the questions that have raised a number of issues and responded by the officer. That's an important part of our committee. I just want to, because there are 1 or 2 members that haven't contributed this morning, just to give an opportunity for anybody else to give a view or ask a question, etc., so that, before we move to a vote. Councillor Pittman, Councillor Dixon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My perspective on this development is that the quality of the living area and the access that these apartments will give will be really beneficial to those people who want to downsize, particularly within Lytham, where they might be living in houses. And some of these houses around this area have very steep stairways, which they cannot access. They really do need a one level place to live. And I do think this will help significantly to allow people to move into better spaces and therefore allow other people to move in and take those previous houses. So I can see positives about this. It is purpose built and it will provide for better living for people who advance in years. And I think I do accept that some of these dwellings around the sidings maybe are feel unhappy, but we've got to make progress on providing for people who have care needs and cannot live comfortably in older dwellings. Thank you.
Councillor Dixon.
Thanks very much, Chair. I mean, as far as the contamination goes, this can only be a good thing for that, really. It's getting rid of it. If the scheme doesn't go ahead, it stays in the ground. And I think perhaps we should look on it as this is one way of getting rid of it. I lived on a property there on Westcliff which backed straight onto that site for many years. And we knew there was something in the ground there, and it was a horrible site, a horrible grey site. So I think this, in the grand scheme of things, is probably better. I understand what Councillor Armitt said before about funding, and I think that's a frustration we all share. I think perhaps that should be taken out of the planning sphere and put into sort of a planning policy meeting that we should have and discuss, because at the end of the day, it's down to the health authorities to ask for a sum of money. That's what they've asked for, that's what they're getting. Perhaps they should have asked for double. That's down to them, that's not down to us as a committee. So I think perhaps that's part of a policy meeting we should have at some point, and a chat, and maybe have someone from the health authorities come and tell us what the thinking is, because we obviously think it's not quite enough money. They do, and they're the health experts. So perhaps we could have that chat on every single planning application we have. So maybe we should take it out of individual applications and have that chat somewhere in future.
Possibly something from one of our scrutiny committees
Yeah,
to consider
quite.
at some point.
That's what I was thinking.
But one of the things I understand what the resident that spoke before said, made some very eloquent points. However, when you look at, the heritage issues, there's no heritage organisation which has objected. When you look at the parking issues, we've exceeded the parking. The highways issues, highways have no problem with it. I don't think there's any reason there for us to say no to this and then win an appeal should the developer appeal. So I think I will be supporting this. Thank you.
I'll just add a couple of comments as well, that in terms of the principle of development, it's been established, I think, that this is a highly accessible location, allocated for housing in the town centre. So in terms of access to other facilities, etc., bus services, etc., they are there on the doorstep. So, what was previously a car park will certainly be improved in terms of this development. So I think that is obviously a key point. And it's really important to sort of, there are, and I often say this, and I share this with the committee, that there are very rarely development proposals without some negative impact, because you've got space here that was allocated for something else before, and now you've got another proposal. And so the job of the committee is to weigh up the benefits and disbenefits of a particular proposal, and it's always a balanced decision. And it's really important, that's why really important to have the questions that we've had and the debate that we've had and the consideration of some of the concerns and issues expressed by members and indeed the speaker that came this morning. and then come to a judgment. I'm going to bring Councillor Nixon in now.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. The development I have no issues with. I can see all sides of every debate we've had today. It was just one query. When you hear of a 3-bedded property, you associate it with a family use, and now this development's got 2 3-bedded properties. Why? I don't get it.
So in terms of the occupancy of this is that there's kind of 2 principal means of occupancy. There's kind of single people, and then there's people in a couple. So if you get a person in a couple, only one of them needs to have that care need. So you might have a couple where one person has a care need and one person doesn't. Yeah, they might have separate bedrooms, they might have children coming to stay, etc. It's really a case of the developers offering that as a product, and that's something that's within the existing building as well. So that's
Yeah,
I
just
suspect
I
that
just didn't
arises.
consider people sleeping apart. That's all. That was. Thank you.
Councillor Farrington, and then we shall move to the vote.
Thank you. I'm slightly confused by the applicant's term as a retirement living complex, because we're talking about pre-registering a care need and a providing one single care provider. There seems to be a contractual arrangement there. I would put that into the realms of it being a care home and not a retirement living complex, because if it's a care home, you would coordinate the care provision either with internal staff or outside agencies. And I do some work in the care arena, so. If it was a care home, which it seems to me to be a care home, would there be different regulations at work here? Because, is this being mislabeled?
I think this is, in planning terms, you can have different levels of care. So you have different products that some are referred to as extra care, which is kind of more independent living where carers visit on a more limited basis. You have care homes, which are kind of more ensuite bedrooms where they don't really have their own additional living areas. So it's really, I suspect that's more of a marketing issue than a planning issue, the way that the site's marketed. It's marketed as a retirement community rather than a care home. But in planning terms, there must be that aspect of care that's provided. There must be a minimum level of care. The applicants told us that the minimum will be 2 hours of care a week, but it's intended to operate on an ascending scale. So as your care needs increase, the amount of care that's provided, it's really to kind of go through that entire process, if you like. So it can increase depending on the care need. The important thing for us is that is an eligibility requirement. A person won't be able to occupy one of these properties unless they have that identified care need and unless they've signed up to one of these care packages. So that's the important thing in planning terms, that puts it into that extra care use and takes it out of a retirement apartment, for example.
So I think really distill my question then is, you say it comes down to marketing, but you're describing a commercial provision of care. Are there different planning regulations that would be in place if it was a care home? I mean, because you could argue on a technicality that if there are, that this should be considered as such, in my opinion.
There isn't a distinction between the level of care that's provided. It doesn't put it into a different planning use class. So they would all still be within the same use class. It doesn't depend on how much care there is. It's just the fact that care is involved that takes it into a different use class from one use to another.
Right. Seconded. So, all those in favour of the recommendations, can you please put your hands up? All those against? Thank you. And I don't think there's any room for abstentions, so I'll just check that. Yeah, okay. So that particular is for the quality of the questions this morning and the debate as well. It's really important that issues are raised and at least are questioned and challenged, and then you come to your own judgment. Thank you for that. We're going to move to item 4 next. Yeah, which will be item 4 is page 100. Thank you to members of the public as well for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Can we just establish whether Councillor Evans has had to go to that appeal and therefore is unlikely to reappear?
I think that was the case, Chairman, yes.
So it looks as if he's gone to that, so he won't be taking part in this particular debate. That's just to make clear, if a member has to leave midway before in a discussion, they can't actually, they can take part in the discussion, but they can't actually vote. I think that's the situation. So we're looking at item 4 here, which is Pathway Stables, Blackpool Road, Newton with Clifton, and concerns the erection of a building for the storage of hay, shavings and machinery associated with adjacent stables. And Matthew, you're still with us, so continue with this particular application, please. Thank you. There are no speakers.
Thank you, Chairman. So the application site is edged here in red. So this is the Pathway site in Newton. So there's quite a recent planning history to this site. You've got an existing bungalow with a garage here. You've got a site here that had a certificate of lawfulness for a retail use associated with the use of these buildings as garden centre. And then you had this existing livery stables here to the rear of the site. All those buildings have now been demolished. So there's an extant permission that's been implemented for the erection of 4 bungalows on this site. As part of that, a new stable block was constructed on this parcel of land here, behind that, and then you've got this existing horse exercise arena that intervenes between the 2 uses. So this is, again, the slightly out-of-date aerial photograph, but this was a former overspill car park for the garden centre. That's now been removed. You've got the existing bungalow and garage here at Pathways, another dorm bungalow here at Longacres. These 2 buildings formerly used as a garden centre, and then this stable block here that's now been replaced on this part of the site. And the horse exercise arena with the bund around it that intervenes between the 2. So this is the planning permission for the stables. So there were 10 stalls within this stable block granted as a replacement for this building. It's a site that's within the area of separation between Newton and Clifton. So there are certain restrictions in terms of the types of development that can take place within that area. So the stables fell within a category of use that's acceptable within a rural area. It included this access into the site off this main access from Blackpool Road, and included the introduction of this landscaping, so this tree and hedge planting along the northern edge of the boundary. So that's recently become operational. This is the housing scheme that was granted for 4 bungalows in place of these existing buildings that have now been demolished. So this is a photograph from 2022 just showing the access onto Blackpool Road. You have this former overspilled parking area that's now been removed. Existing bungalow with pathways and long acres. So this is the access now that's been created towards the stable block. So around the back of the pathway site, off that tarmac entrance drive, and then heading down this access road into the site. You've got this bund up against the horse exercise arena, the existing stable building here. This is the application site, and these timber posts are effectively marking the area where the new landscaping is to be introduced during the next planting season. So this is the existing lean-to on the side of the building. So that's used, this attack room, this is used for the storage of hay. So basically the applicant is saying that that's very limited and we need additional storage on the site. This is the site of the proposed storage building, so this concrete pad, and you've got these gates, one gate into the field for horse turnout and then another gate into the exercise arena here. So the storage building's to be positioned in this area. This is the view from Blackpool Road, looking back towards the site. So you can see the stables at a lower level here to the road, and then you've got this intervening open parcel of land that's important for the area of separation between pathways and Church Farm. And then these posts kind of indicating where that new landscaping is to be introduced alongside the access road. So this is the layout of the proposed building. So 67 square metres, 9 by 7.5 metres, positioned on that existing concrete pad, and then this walkway is kept open between the fields and the exercise arena. So it's 17 metres between the existing stables, so that it's all viewed as part of the same building cluster, up against the backdrop of that bund, and then this landscaping that's to be introduced along with that northern boundary. So the other point to make here is that the building's been positioned so that it doesn't disrupt any of the parking or manoeuvring for the stables within these areas. So these are the plans that were permitted for the stables. So there's 10 stalls within that. So this is livery. So you can potentially have 10 different owners of different horses coming to visit the site. The applicant saying that this area of storage, that's 34 square metres, and that lean-to on the side isn't enough effectively, and that additional storage is needed to serve the use. So this is the building. It's lower than the existing stables, but it's a very similar design, similar materials, timber cladding to the top, concrete block plinth, this roller shutter door on the northern elevation for vehicle loading and unloading. So in terms of the principle, it's in the area of separation. So policy GD3 parts A and D permit either. The use is appropriate to a rural area, including uses which would help to diversify the rural economy. So that was the basis that the existing stables was allowed, or development that is essentially needed for the continuation of an existing enterprise facility or operation. So that's the first test. Does it fall in one of those categories? So the consideration is potentially within both of those categories, in that because it's linked to the stables, it could be a use that's appropriate to a rural area, but it's also something that's needed for the continuation of the existing livery yard. The second test is that the development must be of a type and scale which would not harm the effectiveness of the gap between settlements in protecting the identity and distinctiveness of settlements. So really what that means is that when you walk, when you pass through between Kirkham and Newton on Blackpool Road, you should have the impression of leaving one settlement before entering another, that there should be a gap, the area of separation between the two settlements, and it shouldn't be intensively developed. So that's reflected in the location of the stables. So it's towards the rear of the site, it's behind pathways, behind the existing dwellings, the 4 dwellings that are proposed. It's set back from the roadside, and it doesn't affect that gap between Pathways and Church Farm, that open field that runs between them, which is of greatest importance in preserving that gap between settlements. So it's a very modest size, lower level than the existing stables, but it'll be seen as part of that building cluster. So I've mentioned it's, in that respect, it's tucked away on that lower lying area of land with all those buildings in the foreground. There's additional screening to be provided by the tree and hedgerow planting as part of the stable development. Significant separation, 120 metres, and from the closest existing dwelling, 70 metres away from the closest of the proposed dwellings, that residential scheme, and separated by the intervening exercise arena. In combination with its limited scale, ensures there wouldn't be any adverse impact on the amenity of existing and future occupiers. There's no objections from the Highway Authority, and the storage use is linked to the stables, so in itself it's unlikely to generate any additional vehicle trips above and beyond those which would already be associated with the existing stables. It's in flood zone 1 at the lowest risk of flooding, and there's no other adverse effects arising, so the officer recommendation is for approval.
Thank you. There are no speakers here, so we're going to move straight to members who have questions or concerns. Councillor Armitt, and then followed by Councillor Dixon.
Move to approve. Sorry you've had to waste all this time and effort and money and cost to the council in putting this huge paper together, which the objections don't seem to relate to the proposal. Chris mentioned before about a meeting to discuss things which are material but not, we can't resolve them here. A lot of the councils who object to these things who don't turn up because they're all working full time and can't get time off work. All parish councillors work full time apparently and can't get time to present here. Is there any reason why they can't present by teams? Because they can't vote, and so they can sit at home or at their office and do a quick 3 minutes interruption and do their. And can we look at that as a way forward? Because if they're going to object and they're not going to turn up, and these poor officers have to put all these work in on spurious objections, then I just wish there's a faster way past it. So move to approve.
Yes, I'm going to.
Yeah, just on that additional point, one of the issues identified in the Planning Advisory Services peer review was this issue about items coming before this committee, which may not necessarily be best considered by this committee. So as part of that, the action plan that comes from that is looking at ways in which we could amend and improve that process. So I think in the coming weeks, if not months, I'll be seeking guidance from the committee in terms of ways in which that can be addressed.
Sorry, Chair. Is there anything in the Constitution that stops them presenting by teams? Because they're not voting, they're only talking to us.
I think the actual provisions that we have at the moment are for representations to be made in person rather than online. So it's more of an interaction in person than online. Obviously, we do have the representations in writing to consider. I suppose the issue would, I mean, that obviously goes through to individual members of the public making representations as well. But, we obviously have to carefully manage that. It might become unworkable if we get lots and lots of representations to be made online, sort of digitally or whatever. Like I say, it's something that I think we can look at as part of that wider piece of work. And if there is if it is possible, it's possible. But it might well be that the solution is to avoid those coming here in the first place. But obviously that will be subject to proper scrutiny and consideration.
Yeah, I'm just very briefly just going to mention also, Councillor Armitt, that there's been the establishment of the district and parish planning forum, which is a very new thing. We've only had one meeting so far, but certainly that was set up in terms of responding to some of the PAS review, in terms of relationships between district and parish councils, and a sort of common understanding of planning issues and protocol and processes. And what we're hoping to do through that particular forum, obviously, is to improve understanding from the parish and town council point of view as well of planning issues. And hopefully with that sort of dialogue, that should diminish the number of applications that we might feel are not appropriate coming forward. So that's another aspect to what might resolve some of the problems you've identified. Okay, all right. Okay. Councillor Dixon and then Councillor Nixon.
Thanks very much, Chair. Yeah, happy to second this, and I do echo Councillor the previous statements that were just made there from Councillor Armit. It's even worse than that, though, with this, with the Parish Liaison Committee. If they're going to send in objections because of a conspicuous relationship, which is clearly we don't want to tell you something that we think we know that we might know that has no bearing on it, it's parish tittle tattle. It's frustrating. We should be going back to them and charging them for our officers' time for bringing this today. We really should. So I'm happy to second it, Chair.
Well, what we'd be wanting to do through the planning forum is indicate, the necessity to concentrate on planning issues. And then if they have serious planning issues, then fair enough, they're entitled to come forward. But as you say, some of the reasons for objections are not planning considerations. And that would be one thing that we would hope to explore and perhaps iron out in that process.
Chair, just
Vice Chair just wants to come in as well, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think in this case specifically, it's unfortunate that Councillor Collins is unable to be here today, because I think he would have been happy to address some of the specifics on this. I think the Parish Council also asked that their comments were reproduced verbatim. They are on page 104. The second bullet point in particular, I find it very difficult to understand what they're trying to say. I presume that others have read that and also...
But it's there. It's there for people to come to their own judgment and read
exactly
it.
that.
Yes.
It is there. They asked for it to be reproduced. It has been.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Nixon, did you want to come back?
Did you want to come back?
I just wanted to say, but again, it goes further than that, because they can raise a genuine highways issue. But if this site's already been a garden centre, they should know full well that that's never going to pass muster.
That's part of the more comprehensive
And
understanding
also,
of
if
planning
there's,
issues.
a hay store being put on here, surely that's going to create less traffic than bringing in hay by the barrow load, by the wagon load on frequent occasions.
We've had a proposer in Councillor Armit, we've had a proposer in a seconder in Councillor Dixon, but I will bring in Councillor Nixon and Councillor Griffiths who wish to speak.
Thank you, Chair. It's just a query regarding the existing stable block has a lean-to area where it's got that you showed a picture of. It's got a store. It's being used as that. Is that going to be used for something else now, or is it going to continue as a store? And because they've got a whole new building for a store.
Question.
So the way this has been put to us is that this is in addition to the storage that they've got at the moment. So the issue that they're having is that there isn't enough capacity for storage on the site because of the number of horses and the number of different owners. The stable block was also reduced in height as part of the previous application, so there was some storage within the roof space that was lost as a result of that. So it's really the case that it's in addition to what's already there, and it is slightly different things that are being stored in there.
Thank you. Griffiths.
Yeah, I just want to say I support this. I can see the size of the livery. You're going to need a lot of storage. But on the parish council point, it's made up of many people from different areas of your area. We get public coming to parish council who can't or won't come to speak here. So we give their point of view as well. I just wanted to make it clear. We don't try and waste time. Okay.
I think the final point I would make is the technically the really important element in this particular application also is the fact that obviously the property here that the enterprise is in an area of separation. And I think I'm right in saying, I think I've had this confirmed before, that the area of separation is to prevent, obviously, communities coalescing. But it's actually our policy. It's not a national policy, but it's one that we need to be concerned to protect as far as possible. And that's why you see in the report, it makes some sort of note of mentioning that this particular storage facility is within other existing buildings and facilities, but also there is extensive screening and landscaping there, because an area of separation, and we've been here a number of times, is something that is an important status, isn't it, Matthew? That we have to have that extra level of scrutiny in terms of development within that.
Yes, it's a designation that's specific to Files local plan, but other authorities do have similar designations that are worded quite differently. But it kind of sits between the green belt at the top of the hierarchy, and then the countryside. In terms of those protected areas, you've got the countryside area of separation, then green belt in the hierarchy. So yeah, it's limited categories of development that can take place within it, but things like stables are one of those exceptions that you expect to see in these types of rural locations.
And the final point is the reports and the discussions we have. I've always made quite a strong point here that in terms of member training, when you're on the committee, these are opportunities as well to have that discourse, to have that dialogue, to be able to get answers to questions. Sometimes you won't be satisfied, but there's an added layer of explanation, and therefore that is part of becoming a more proficient planning member of the committee, because you build up your knowledge then, which is really important. I think we've got, was it Councillor Armitt proposed, Councillor Dixon seconded. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Thank you. Item 2.
Page 13 of the report.
Thank you. Can I thank Matthew Taylor for his presentations and answering all those questions. Thank you, Matthew.
Yeah, thank you,
Thank
Matthew.
you. And we welcome Rob Buffon now for this particular item, which is an outline. This is Lytham Road, Wharton, and this is an outline planning application for the demolition of the existing buildings and structures and the erection of a residential care home with up to 76 bedrooms, classed C2, including a substation, vehicular access, I thought that would bring a response, car parking, servicing and other associated works. Access, appearance, layout and scale applied for only because it's an outline planning application and not reserved matters. Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
No speakers.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, so this is the second care facility application on this month's agenda. So the application site is as per the red edge on the left-hand image. The aerial image on the right-hand side just demarks where the application site is in relation to the conurbation of Wharton. The application site is shown by the red star. So as you can see, we've got Great Birchwood to the west and here. We've got Great Birchwood, and then coming into Wharton, we've got the Land Registry. Start to hit the settlement of Wharton in this area where we've got the new houses almost complete but not fully occupied as yet. Then we got the application site, and then British Aerospace, obviously more centrally located within Wharton. The site, as you can see, is on the main road through Wharton, so occupies a very prominent site on a main thoroughfare, which obviously connects the Fylde coast to particularly Wharton, but with obviously Preston, Blackpool and settlements beyond. Just a bit of site context. So the application site is just defined by those red dots. As we can see, the frontage of the site is occupied by a dwelling. dwelling there. And then this is a partially constructed dwelling that has ceased construction. Obviously, it's partly constructed, so it's up to roof level. The surfaces, the external appearance is certainly not finished as yet. The remainder of the site is hard standing and operates as a caravan storage area. Boundary feature wise, we have a mature hedgerow to the south, and then we have some hedgerow and tree planting along the western boundary with the residential development, which we can see there is under construction. Existing access points, there's an existing access off Lytham Road in this location, just down from the junction of Bank Lane. That isn't used at the moment, with access for the bungalow on the site coming in from this direction, and then access for the caravan storage area in this location here. The character of the area is predominantly residential. There's a mix of bungalow and two-storey developments. There's a mix of semi-detached and terrace properties. There's red brick, and we've got random construction materials in that as well. So just a couple of existing site photos. So at the top left, we can see the existing bungalow on site. Obviously, it's quite recently constructed. In the background, we can see the partly constructed bungalow that lies adjacent to Lytham Road. In the bottom left, obviously, is a snapshot of that partly constructed bungalow. And as you can see, there's a lot of construction material, disused vehicles, those kind of things, which are within that garden area. And bearing in mind how close they are to Lytham Road itself, certainly detracts from the experience that you get when you're travelling through Wharton at this time. Just a few photos of the storage area for the caravans. This is set to the north, so not as close to Lytham Road, but nonetheless you can still see the caravans from Lytham Road itself. I picked up on the surrounding character before, just a few snapshots there of the types of dwellings that we can find in that locality. So the top left, you can see obviously the terrace design, the bungalow design in the bottom left, the central images of the new houses which are in situ to the west. You can see that there's a commonality of materials in the sense that the red brick, there's use of render, there's a hipped roof form, for example. There are a few commercial properties, so this bottom right image is a kitchen and bathroom, I think, commercial premises. Obviously you can see there that it's clad in more, I think it's a UPVC grey cladding material, which is probably more in contrast to what the prevalent materials are in that area. So moving on to the development, it is an outline, but layout is applied for, and the only matters that aren't applied for in the circumstances is landscaping. So all buildings on site are going to be demolished. The footprint, as you can see, is an I-shaped footprint. That footprint is set back 20 metres from Lytham Road, and the reason for that is to tie in with a build line that exists to either side of the site. So there's a property here which hasn't been constructed as yet, and then there's an existing property here, so you can see that there's a approximate alignment of the front elevation of the building proposed with the build line that exists either side of the site. We have a landscape parking area to the frontage which provides that setback arrangement. That provides 36 parking spaces, there's 4 electric vehicle charging spaces in there, disabled provision, an ambulance bay which is located close to the front entrance of the building here, and then we have a cycle store in this location side of the building. The site is obviously landscaped. The indicative proposals landscaping wise show obviously grass spaces, private gardens for residents which are going to be tree and shrub planted. The hedge line to the frontage of the site, that will be retained, albeit there's going to be an element of removal around the access arrangements which require widening of that existing access. The existing trees and hedgerows along the western boundary are going to be retained, with the exception of a tree in this location that has to be removed for health reasons. Hedgerow will be provided along all other boundaries of the site, and that will be interspersed by trees as well. Just a snapshot of the floor plans that are proposed. I could have detailed the floor plans in full at ground and first floor levels, but this is probably gives you the best flavour without going into all the detail of all levels. So you can see there that we've got up to 76 ensuite bedroom spaces. I suppose the subtle difference between this scheme and the scheme you previously considered was the Matthews scheme was more based upon self-contained living. So you'd have bedroom spaces, but you'd also have kitchen and dining spaces. Whereas in this circumstance, the care model is different in the sense it reflects more of a care home, whereby residents would have a bedroom and bathroom, but then would have access to more communal spaces such as lounge and dining room areas. There's a cafe bistro in there, cinema, hair and nail salon, and there's also, as well as the internal lounge spaces, there's also external roof terraces at first floor. So obviously that'll give residents, as well as private garden spaces, those people who perhaps aren't as able to get into the garden spaces, an opportunity to still have fresh air. Elevation wise, that's front elevation. The application was subject to a pre-application dialogue with myself. We worked quite hard, particularly on the front elevation of the building, to try and introduce some symmetry. As you can see here, we have a terraced appearance, which is reflective of terraces that exist within the street scene. It's 2-storey, it's a mix of red brick and render. We've got a central glazed feature here, and the reason for that is to give some additional activity to that frontage, but also to demarc what would be the pedestrian entrance into the building. The images below are just some architectural artist impressions of what the building will look like. Similarly, for the side elevations, you can see that the gable detail that exists on the front is incorporated on elevations to side and rear. They act to break up the wall plate, but also the mass of the building and the roof form, which you can see there. The roof terrace, which I mentioned earlier, there's one on the side of the building, as you can see in that image to the bottom. Again, just more elevations. That's the eastern elevation, which faces the main area of Wharton. And again, that's the northern elevation, which is a simplified version of what you would see on the front elevation of the building. So, moving on, main issues, principle. The site is within the settlement boundary of Wharton, as we can see as the image on the right hand side. The settlement boundary is defined by that grey line. It's unallocated, but is surrounded by housing allocations and is previously developed land. So on that basis, the site development does comply with a locational strategy at least, which encourages all sorts of development to those areas. Policy H2, that supports specialist accommodation for the elderly, and as Matthew probably advised previously, that is due to the high proportion of elderly residents that we have, which is expected to rise quite significantly in the future years. The main reason why we have 100% specialist accommodation within this development is based upon obviously the nature of the development. So it's ensuite bedroom facilities with access to community facilities, but also the fact there is an age restriction of over 55s, and all residents will need to have care needs. So on that basis, the principle of development is supported, but that is subject to conditions restricting age and requiring care for residents. You probably would have picked up on the fact that some of the land uses proposed are town centre uses, so such as the cinema, such as the hair salon. We wouldn't necessarily want general members of the public coming to this establishment for those uses. We would want them to go to Wharton local centre. So on that basis, we put a restriction on those uses to ensure that they are just used by residents, visitors or staff. Design and visual appearance. Also, we have policy GD7, which requires high standards of design, and that's to take account of character and appearance. The proposal incorporates traits of the existing development surrounding, so it's 2-storey in scale, it's reflective of a terrace appearance, it's got use of red brick and render materials and a hipped roof form. The building setback 20 metres from the road edge, so obviously is reflective of building lines where that exists at the moment. We've got retention of existing landscape features, but also there's new landscape features to bolster those which are in situ at the moment. So bearing in mind the existing site appearance, we consider it provides localised enhancement and certainly improves the visual appearance of the street scene. Highways wise, again, GD7 requires development to not prejudice highway or pedestrian safety or the efficient and convenient movement of highway users. Parking wise, the new SPD requires 1 space per 5 residents. The proposals involve a single point of entry from Lytham Road, and that obviously involves alterations to the existing access arrangement, including localised widening so that vehicles can freely move side by side to each other. Main issue with this is that the Highway Authority has no objection, but in their comments they did suggest that the access arrangement was moved closer or in an easterly direction to this area of the site. In response to that, the applicant pushed back, demonstrating the acceptability of the proposed access arrangement. The Highway Authority maintained their initial position, but conceded that the location of that access arrangement wouldn't impact significantly on highway safety. So that's allowed us to provide support for the access arrangement as originally proposed. Amenity-wise, GD7 is the main policy. The building itself provides very good separation to neighbours, as you can see here. The green line demarks the back of properties or the side of properties. Obviously, the purple figures, they give us the separation to the buildings themselves. There are a couple of roof terraces in the development which are circled red. Now, obviously the use of a roof terrace could result in residents sitting out for quite prolonged periods. So whilst we do have good separation, I think it's still necessary to have the sides of these terraces to the west at least obscure glazed. So there's a condition required for that means. There's no other technical reasons to warrant refusal, and the recommendation is that members support the application subject to Section 106 for healthcare contributions, appropriate conditions and adoption of the Shadow Habitat Regulation Assessment. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation, Rob, and we swiftly move on. Councillor Settle.
Thank you, Chairman. It's obviously very high quality development, and as we said earlier, there's a great need for this in the area. Having spent 43 years going up and down that road to aerospace, I know very well that area was a dump until very recently with the new housing, and that area you're talking about there is still a mess. So this can only improve the area and satisfy a demand at the same time. So I'm very happy to propose acceptance.
We take note of that, so we have a proposer, but we'll continue with the debate, and I'll invite, if there's a seconder. Oh, we've got a seconder. Councillor Pittman?
Councillor Pittman.
Oh, yeah. Did you want to second it, or did you want to speak as well? Both, okay. All right. Well, we've got a proposer in Councillor Settle, and we'll see who offers then when we come along. Okay. So, Councillor Pittman.
Wow. 70. There is no care home in Wharton. There are 3 in Freckleton, but they're not purpose built. This one obviously has attractions because, yes, it is just exactly what is needed in a care home facility. And I have had lots of experiences of going into care homes. So consequently, I speak from some experience. I am disappointed, and the parish council was also disappointed about this access from the main road. Basically, and it hasn't really been emphasised, there is a private road on the right-hand side running up to the caravan storage and servicing station. So this is basically and has been sort of industrial site where people from far and wide have come to deposit their camper vans and caravans. Basically, there is a perfectly good access there. And bearing in mind the problems on Lytham Road, the speeding traffic, the fact that people cannot cross with any degree of safety because there's no crossings at all along this point. And obviously, yes, there is a bus stop there, very close, but it is very difficult to cross that road with safety. There were problems about the access to Rivers Lee and the splaying to enable visibility. So I am surprised that the Highways Authority have decided there isn't a real problem, particularly as this access to this care home would be opposite Bank Lane. Now, Bank Lane does generate quite a lot of traffic because there are two large caravan parks down there. So there's a lot of toing and froing and trying to access the Lytham Road. Plus the fact there are old people's homes just on the right-hand side of Bank Lane in proximity to the main road. So it's not an easy area, but to put another access point there, I find absolutely amazing and say, oh, it's not going to really matter. Well, it will matter to people trying to cross the road. It'll matter to people trying to get out of Bank Lane, and it'll cause extra problems. So I am emphasising that because the parish council have raised that as an issue. Why this applicant decided he didn't want to use his access road to his garage and his caravans, I will never know. It is a messy site. This would enhance it.
Do you want us to try and deal with that immediate point before?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, no. I think
Yeah,
that would be
of course,
an
of course.
opportune moment to respond.
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with this area. I used to live on Bank Lane, so I do appreciate how busy Bank Lane can get from time to time, and of course Lytham Road. The initial comments from the Highway Authority raised the access as a concern and suggested it moving it in an easterly direction away from the Bank Lane junction. The access arrangement, there is an existing access there at the moment. So it's in that location there, and the applicant rebutted the highway comments on grounds that when you're turning right into the site or turning right into Bank Lane, there isn't any conflict of vehicles. And that's led obviously the Highway Authority to not object to the highway arrangement. They still suggest it's relocated, but they don't feel there's sufficient grounds to refuse the application on highway safety. The other point in terms of the use of the existing access that provides access to the bungalow, the caravan storage area and the caravan site beyond, the red edge doesn't include that access arrangement. Now, I can only assume from that any would-be occupier, etc., has no access right over that land. Now, it's intended, I think, to reserve this land to provide access to the housing allocation that comes forward in time. I can't say with any assurance to that, but if you look at this, you'll see that's the access arrangement along that route. That's developed. This is that's an allocated site that hasn't been developed out as yet, but will obviously require an access arrangement to get to it. So I think the intended purpose is to reserve a slither of that land to widen the access arrangement to facilitate access to the housing development when that comes forward. I mean, at the end of the day, though, like I said previously, the Highway Authority haven't objected to the access arrangement that is proposed. So,
I think this is a classic example, isn't it, that to some extent, you know, a sort of common sense approach to this would indicate somewhat of a problem, but I think that explanation shows why they can't use that road up the side, and because it's not part of the planning application, it's not part within their remit. So that in a way sort of knocks that one out, doesn't it? That option. And we've been here before, haven't we, with sort of, you know, with Singleton, etc., with access off a main road, haven't we, with Lancashire County Councils going and putting forward a view that they don't have, and that's a significant thing to take into account in terms of any contemplation of refusal, that, you know, the statutory highways authority haven't raised an objection in the end. I think they had some concerns from the sound of it, didn't they? But they haven't actually formally raised an objection. Is that right?
no, they didn't formally object in their initial response. It was simply a recommendation that they feel that it would be betterment to the scheme if it was relocated. But obviously the application itself is supported with highway information that looks at the amount of trips on the network at the moment, the additional trips which could be created by the development, and obviously there is a fallback position because there are existing trips to the site at the moment in terms of the dwelling, the caravan storage facilities. So taking all of that into the round, along with the applicant's rebuttal in terms of the initial concerns about the access arrangement, then that's led the Highway Authority to support the scheme on grounds that there isn't sufficient highway safety reasons for refusal.
Do you want to come back?
Yes, please. Basically, there hasn't been much of or less of a problem on highway safety lately, because basically you can't get through Wharton at all. You just queue and queue and queue. There must be a new planning team there compared with the days when Rivers Lee was being developed, because that was a real concern about how much traffic was going to be generated. So, yes, they've changed their tune, but it is still a problem that if that land to the north is developed, there will be a lot more traffic coming out of that second entrance that they are reserving. On the ground, I do not think they're being realistic about the problems, and particularly problems of pedestrians and residents around there who want to cross that road. And it is, at many times of the day, it is extremely busy. The other problem, as I see it, is the amount of car parking for that development. Basically, 76 residents will require a lot of carers to be working there. And I admit some can travel on buses. I've seen lots of carers working using bus route, the bus to get to their clients. But if you count the staffing and yes, the daytime service providers, etc., there isn't enough, particularly when you're saying this is a maximum of 70 odd people who will be visited, who will have to call in extra specialist carers to come in and deal with their problems. So I do not, and they're going to use some of those spaces for electric charging points. I don't consider that to be realistic. I think there is an overdevelopment of that site. I know there are lots of green spaces around that, and it looks pretty. But it doesn't alter the fact that there should be better access for the vehicles. It is too tight as far as I can see.
Could I just come
around
in
there.
here? Because there was just a question here about, you know, the number of carers accessing the site. I mean, if you've got, you know, somebody probably can answer this, but if you've got 76 residents, presumably there will be some carers coming in for more than one within the residency, within the unit. It won't be necessarily one-to-one, will it? I mean, they may have care responsibilities for more than one person within that unit, so that would reduce the number of. I'm asking a question. I don't know, Rob.
Yeah,
Can you answer
Joe,
that?
I think the number of carers
Okay.
within the or might be required by the development is a bit of a moot point, to be honest with you. We have obviously adopted car parking standards, which have been quite recently adopted by the council. And those standards require one space per 5 residents for this type of accommodation. I think one thing to bear in mind is also that the accessibility of the site. The applicants have submitted a travel plan, which is a commitment towards encouraging alternative modes of transport. So it's car sharing, cycling. So we can see there's a cycle store in the scheme. It's within the settlement. They'll be recruiting from the local area. Now that could be Wharton, it could be Freckleton. So there will be possibility for access other than by car. And when you build into the bigger picture, bearing in mind that there is more car parking within the scheme than what is required by the adopted standard, but also the sustainability of the site in terms of how accessible it is to alternative means of transport, then that altogether would justify the car parking that's required, and that's how the applicant has tailored their argument in support of the car parking requirements. But also, as I say, from a pure assessment perspective, we fall back on the SPD, and that demonstrated to us quite clearly that what's been proposed is acceptable in those terms.
And if I can just come in, that we're back here to this argument, aren't we? That, you know, we might not be happy. You might have a subjective judgment that there isn't enough parking for that, but actually, in terms of, you know, our own policies, they are policy compliant, and therefore the thought that you could refuse, I'm not saying you're putting that forward anyway, but if you were to refuse on that basis, it may be rather tenuous in terms of, you know, the actual SPD parking formula actually means that there is sufficient parking.
Yeah. Obviously, we have to make consistent decisions, and one of those consistency is obviously compliance with the policies that we have and the supplementary guidance that we have. And if we are to digress away from that policy or guidance, then it has to be on sound and defendable grounds. And say I can't see what justification there is for digressing away from those policies or guidance at this time for this particular development.
I wanted to move on, but very quickly, if you wanted to help with that,
no,
even though it might be a moot point,
No,
I would like
it's-
to know.
It's just to allay Councillor Pittman's fears, because I actually work for a care home group called Bayswood, and we gear up ratio-wise to just under a third car parking spaces in relation to bedrooms. So Alexandra in Poulton, 102 bedrooms, we have just under 30 spaces. Parkview on Lytham Road, as you go into Blackpool, there is 42 beds, 15 or 16 spaces. I was just typing them up in my head. Never an issue. This is over provisioned based on my experience. I just thought I would bring that real life experience in. Okay.
And that's very helpful. Thank you for that intervention. We're going to go to Councillor Griffiths now, please.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm glad to see this proposal for Wharton. It's much needed. But I did also have concerns on where the access out onto the road is. But you've covered that, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Griffiths. Councillor Nixon, who I think is on second this, I think.
Yes, yeah, I did, yeah, second it. It was just a question of that bungalow there, I take it that's been totally demolished, that newish looking bungalow, that's been demolished?
This one?
No, that's not a newish, that one.
That bungalow's going.
Right, that's
Either the new one that's occupied or I'm hoping that's.
So you've got a lot of building waste there, haven't you? That is.
Been in that state for a long time as well.
Yeah, I understand the rubbishy stuff, yeah, but that new one's not.
No.
And that's going to be completely demolished. But how are they going to? Are they going to reuse some of that stuff, or do they not have to say what they're going to do with that? Are they just going to
I
knock
very
it down
much
and have
doubt
done with
they'll
it?
be reusing construction materials.
Right, it just seems such a waste. And the other thing, the tree recommendations will they be followed from the tree officer, or are they just recommendations and they will be followed or they won't be followed?
This is an outline application. So they will need to go through another application process for the outstanding reserve matters, which is landscaping. Obviously, we've got an indicative landscaping arrangement from them, which shows retention of majority of the hedgerow to the south, majority of trees to the west, as well as enhancement of tree and landscape and hedgerow planting, those kind of things. But obviously, I would expect when the landscape reserve matters application comes in for those hedgerow and trees that they've indicated for retention to be retained within that landscaping scheme as well. And I think there are also, there's a condition requiring such to be provided within the reserve matter submission as well. So
they know not to damage them during the build period then? You know, all the outlying hedgerow and they know it's, yeah, they've got to protect it basically before they...
So if you refer to condition 5, that refers to the requirement for landscaping, but also requires compliance with a landscape strategy that they've provided. So that obviously requires them to comply with the retention of trees and hedgerows to the south and western boundaries.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Arnott.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, it looks great. Good addition to the area. There's always going to be changes when it comes to access and egress. Of course, there is. Almost 50% car parking is higher than we get with some businesses that we set up. So it's, you know, you look at the mess we made up near B&Q. This is much better than that. Going back to my earlier point and just doing a little bit of mathematics, because we do struggle with math sometimes in the council. Yeah, I mean, Gavin might be right that the 76 residents might move in here from a local area. But that means there's 76 empty houses with 76 new families will move into them. So still the medical stuff goes up. It doesn't stay the same. It still increases by that number. 20k this time. I guess it's going to the same place, is it?
Yep.
Yeah, great. And these are people who are in a care home. It is absolutely taking Chris's point. We do need to talk about this. There's nothing we can do about it. It's a government thing. It doesn't work. And, you know, we read the NHS every day is struggling massively. This just doesn't work. 20k for 76 people, one-off payment, madness.
Councillor Arnott, can you just spit on that specific point that Mark wants to...
Yeah.
Yeah, just to confirm, following that discussion earlier on, I've actually emailed the scrutiny team to ask them to address that, so that will go on to the list of things to be discussed. So the key thing is that this committee approved that paper that set out this methodology back in December 2019. So it is a paper and a methodology that's had the approval of this committee previously. Obviously, we have new governance arrangements now, so that any future review and policy, etc., would have to be considered separately. But it is that, as was said earlier, it is that it is a formula that was originally put forward by the NHS. Back then, it was the Clinical Commissioning Group, which had been replaced by these integrated care boards. So that is something that was looked at that time, put forward by them, and then they continue to operate that, notwithstanding the fact that there have been more recent legal challenges, as Matthew was explaining earlier on. So, like I say, that's where it is, and that's how we need to move on to look at this, I think.
So just getting to my point on, actually, you've brought another interesting point up there. That when we used to look at our own planning stuff in this group, this is a non-political group allegedly, and this is meant to look at things in a non-biased way, and we can therefore look at these sort of things and challenge them. We're now handing it to a political biased group that doesn't have any neutrality and also doesn't have all planning qualified people on it to discuss something they don't understand much, they don't have the experience of, and they're politically biased. So it's a bit of a waste of time taking it out of planning and giving it to a political group. But forget that. My point was going to be,
I think we ought to say that to discredit the scrutiny process is for another time and another debate. But
it is politically biased, though, isn't it? No. It's not. Same thing. So my point was going to be, you put a condition in that the potentially commercial areas shouldn't be used by residents. Wharton is not the strongest town centre area we have of our villages, and having only 76 residents, of which there'd probably be a split of sexes, to maintain commercially a hairdressers in that numbers is probably going to be quite a struggle on very low numbers. And I'm not sure it would harm the town centre, or actually probably help the town centre to add an extra commercial element in. And I'm not sure that's the potentially best condition, unless it's a condition that's been asked for by the people.
Thanks, Councillor. I mean, it's standard practice really to try and protect the health of our existing centres. So anything which could potentially compete with any centre or uses within centres, then obviously it could undermine the strength of those centres. So I would advise that it's kept. Obviously, it's at this committee's liberty to remove that condition if they see fit. But professionally, obviously, I would suggest that it is retained to maintain the health of the Wharton Centre.
Thank you. I'm just going to go to Councillor Dixon, Councillor Farrington, and if absolutely necessary, Councillor Pittman can come back in. Okay.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, again, just wanted to raise just the snarkiness of what's coming from the parish council to be comparing this to a far superior overall facilities that were mentioned down the road. It's not planning again. It's not a planning consideration. And again, the £20,000 gesture in inverted commas, that's what's been asked for. It's trying to belittle the developer here as only putting £20,000 in. The developer's gone to the NHS and the NHS have said, we want £20,000 and they've given it. You know, we shouldn't be belittling that. We should perhaps be questioning the NHS why that amount's so low. But again, that is a question for the NHS to answer, not for us as a planning committee, not for any political committee. It is a process that needs looking at from the NHS health professionals' perspective, not from us or anyone else really. And just to make people aware, Holland House and Fernbank Surgery actually have expanded now to Freckleton. So you can get appointments in Freckleton for those two surgeries. And if you want a surgery on a Saturday to see a doctor, let me tell you, it's empty. You can easily get in there at the second. It's a fantastic service, the one that we've used with our children when they've needed to go. We've gone and taken the appointment over that way on a Saturday, and we've had a selection of times and places that we can go to. So hopefully that money will be put to good use that way.
And of course, cumulatively, over two applications, Holland House will have received £30,000, you know, towards their needs.
Can I just add, I mean, I think it's so important to realise that money is to go towards clinical provision as opposed to additional staff hours. It has to be some kind of physical alterations, so whether that's an extension or internal reconfiguration to provide more doctor space, those kind of things. It can't just be towards staffing hours.
Councillor Farrington.
Yeah, just to clarify, real world usage of things like hair salon in a care home, what you'll find is there's not a full-time staff there at all. You'll see a mobile hairdresser come in maybe once or twice a week, and out of all the residents, maybe half a dozen to a dozen will take up the service. So it won't be used by local residents at all. So it won't compete with the town centre. That's how it works in the real world. Okay.
Again, thank you. That's very reassuring. Councillor Pittman.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to make the point that basically I was disappointed with how much money would go to the health provision. It's a drop in the ocean compared with what is necessary to provide. But yes, the Freckleton facility is very useful, particularly for people in Freckleton and Wharton. I would hate to think that a development in Wharton ends up delivering money to Lytham, spent in Lytham, which basically, in a way, detracts from Freckleton and that very good health centre there, where most people would go normally. But Holland House doesn't actually send many doctors to Freckleton, and that is a shame, bearing in mind that this is a Wharton planning application, and therefore the rural area should benefit rather than just giving it to Lytham. I'm maybe just being a little bit cynical, bearing in mind what happens in education, where the money for schools ended up in Lytham. I do think we should keep things rural if possible.
We've taken note of those comments,
Yeah.
Councillor Pittman. I see what you're saying. I think it was Councillor Settle and then Councillor Nixon who proposed and seconded this. So if we've concluded the debate, I think we have. All those in favour, please indicate. Anybody against? Abstentions? One abstention. All right. Ray Green. So we're back to application 1, item 1. Again, there are no speakers on this particular item, so we'll have a presentation. I think Mark's doing this one. We'll have a presentation on this and then move to questions and the debate. Thank you, Rob. Thank you.
Right, Ray Green Tennis Club. Afternoon all. So this is an application relating to the tennis club. It's a long-established club. It sits to the west of the centre of the village of Ray Green. That circle has actually moved across. It's actually slightly off centre, but it's just in this area to the side there. The application site, let's say, is well established. It's between the villa and the village. There are currently 3 surface courts there. They're lined end to end in a narrow linear arrangement with a small sort of pavilion clubhouse. And it actually falls within the settlement. 2 of the courts are proposed to be floodlit by 12 lighting columns. Now, just to re-emphasise there, that in the report, I think it actually says that there's 24 columns. But just to say that is not correct. It is actually 12 6.5 metre high columns. So just like to bring that to the committee's attention. And the clear intention of that is to allow the tennis to be extended into the hours of darkness. The parish council have objected. We've gone back to them with some revised proposals, but they've maintained that objection, and that's all set out in the agenda papers. But the officer recommendation is for approval, and therefore the application is here for consideration. So looking at it in more detail, those are the two courts which are proposed to be floodlit. So you can see there's a third one that will remain unlit farther down. And in terms of some photographs, the top left is showing the access into the club. You can just see the building, the timber building, which is the clubhouse pavilion. And again, that's the same building that's on the bottom there on the right, bottom right, and the right of the bottom right. And you can see the courts themselves are hard surfaced, surrounded by fencing, much as you expect in most tennis facilities, I suppose. Looking down the site, you can see on the top left photo, you can see the residential properties just behind the hedge in this area here. Is that coming through? Yeah. The hedge is replaced more by fencing down here, but again, you can see residential properties. In the distance, beyond the site, as you're coming along the road past the villa and coming into the village that way, there's a modern house that's been relatively recently constructed, and that's the back of that property there, just to locate it a bit more. Again, this is closer to those properties, residential properties, fence, and in particular this one here has got quite a large dormer at the back that overlooks the tennis courts. But you can see that there is an area of grass and seating between the two. The lights themselves are shown on the detail on here, so this is just to confirm that there are 6 on each court, making 12. 3 on each side of each court, and this is the elevation. So it's a 6.5 metre post with an angled light at the top. Looking at this bottom right picture first, this is one of the baffles that will be put on to stop light spill coming back in the wrong direction from where it's seeking to achieve the lighting. And then this is sort of a lighting contour plan, for want of a better phrase, which shows that the lighting, the stronger lighting, is directed directly to the court. And apparently the set up here with a number of lights and the height and the angle, etc., is what's being put forward by to requirements to meet the Lawn Tennis Association's requirements. But basically, what happens here is as you go away from the courts, the amount of light from apparent diminishes. Light is something that it always spills. You know, you only have to look at a major urban area from a distance. There will be a glow, a general glow. So it's about how you minimise the disturbance to neighbours. So that's one way of doing it, is through the baffling. There aren't any speakers. The other way of doing it is through obviously limiting the hours. So in principle, it's in the urban area, in the settlement area. It's acceptable from that point of view. Visually, the lights are well screened. They sit against existing trees and shrubs, and it's an existing area. So there's 2 issues. One is the light itself, which I've covered. The other one is noise. Obviously, if you can play longer, any disturbance from noise is exacerbated. And many ball sports where balls are bouncing do have that percussive noise, which can be more intrusive than perhaps a sound meter would register. The club wanted to open till 10:30. Our environmental protection team have suggested 9 would be a more reasonable time. That would be the operation of the lighting. Obviously, in the summer when hours go on, beyond that, there's no hours restriction on this club, so it could be used, in summer until later. That is a restriction on the use of the lights. The other issue that lighting causes is an ecological one. Bats in particular are affected by light sources, can be disturbed, can be disorientated. Following some additional work, our ecology advisors are happy that there will be a minimal risk, and therefore feel that the 9 PM restriction also has a benefit from an ecology point of view. So there are a number of conditions set out on the agenda paper that control the form of development. And subject to those, the recommendation is one of approval. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Ahmed.
Well, clearly this again shines a spotlight on the problem with parish council objections. Look, this is just it's pettiness, isn't it? We're not a country that's very good at tennis. We're not a very country that's very good at sport. And yet we try and make it harder and harder for people who want to do exercise to do it. And if you're doing competitions here, you're going to go on way later than this. So tennis is primarily outdoors as summer sport. From May to September, you can play till 10:30, 11 anyway. And there's no restrictions, and there has never been restrictions. So the noise thing is a joke because they've been doing it for the last 30 or 40 years. These sort of people who object to this, you remove the tennis court and stick in a caravan park, and suddenly they're saying, "I wish I had the tennis courts back." And so it's a lovely summer sport of a ball bouncing up and down, people enjoying themselves and grunting a little bit if they're professionals. If it's in Australia, they can play till 4 in the morning and they love it because they're better at this than we are. This is daft. We're talking about if you're going out yesterday to play tennis till 10 o'clock at night, good luck with you. It ain't going to happen. So it's barely needed. Give them what they want. Give them, and let's compromise. Let's say 10 o'clock then. That enables them to finish their competitions. It's still daylight for most of the year. It isn't. Most people are not in bed by 10 o'clock. Yes, absolutely move to approve, but change the condition till 10 p.m. as a compromise.
Okay, thank you. So you changed the proposal then to 10 p.m. The proposal is 9 p.m. So we have to take that into account. You may get support for that, you may not. Councillor Evans, please.
Thank you, Chair, for letting me take part. I will have to nip out again because I've got another meeting going on at the same time. My points are realistically, again, we've seen a lot of developments in Ray Green, so to have some recreational facilities is good for the village. I also note that Councillor Andrews, who knows all things Ray Green, is in favour, and if it's good enough for Councillor Andrews, it's good enough for me. So I'm quite happy, although I will have to go. So I realise I can't take part in the vote itself, but I'm very much in favour of promoting healthy sport in rural files. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim, please.
Yeah, I've got experience playing, training football late as a coach now lapsed, but I know how much floodlights can encroach on surrounding land. The point here that's important, I think, and the devil is in the detail in this one, is the bafflers that stop the lighting. Would you kindly, Mark, go back to the light pollution spill and sort of maybe indicate where the houses are? Is it the green line where the houses are?
I think that is the actual boundaries.
Yeah.
But apartments area is pretty symmetrical.
Okay. Well, it's a difficult one without seeing something in situ, because my heart tells me that yeah, we need more sport, and I totally agree with a lot of Councillor Armitt's points about the country and our attitude to sport. What I would say though is I wouldn't support an extension to 10. I would think we need to restrict it to 9 because of the pollution issues. Okay, thank you.
Yes, and I was going to say that I'm probably going to support this, but I would only support it with the 9 p.m. curfew in terms of, because I think, to be fair, taking in all the points that Councillor Armitt has made very passionately about sport, etc., our job is also to take into account the impact of the development on residents and the residential community. And I think if we were very honest and we were living in some properties on the edge of this, we would be at least concerned. Whether we would go as far as objecting to it is another thing. But it is an understandable concern in a residential community that the introduction of lights for 2 of these courts, that will represent a minimal perhaps, but it will represent an intrusion into, you know, what their experience is of living where they live. because clearly showing that, you know, there is a spread. What I feel here, and I will bring other people in, but it's a good opportunity to say this, is I would, again, it's a balance, but I would look at the measures put in place, including the curfew of 9 p.m, as a way of mitigating the impact of lighting in this. That said, it seems to be that what they're proposing are minimum Lawn Tennis Association requirements in terms of the strength of the light and the amount of light being provided. And you know, that's something we ought to bear in mind as well, is that it's sort of a minimum requirement if you're going to put lighting in there at all. They've put less of it and less intense lighting. So, you know, I think we will go back to eventually to Councillor Armitt's proposal, because that's what we have to do. But I won't be supporting it. I will be supporting approval, but I won't be supporting the 10 p.m. extension. I think the 9 p.m. is an appropriate, sufficient control of this light and activity. Because remember, it's not just, if you switch the lights off at 9 o'clock at night, other than peak summer, you're curtailing that activity. And I think I'm mindful that we want to support successful sporting clubs, and as Councillor Andrews said, many of the members are living in Ray Green. Some will come from further afield, I'm sure, but a number of them are local. And we have to have the welfare of residents as well as a factor. So I'm going to go now to Councillor Griffiths, followed by Councillor Settle, and then Councillor Nixon.
Yeah, I'd be prepared to second this, but only on the 9 o'clock finish for the lights, please.
We'll come back. But we'll go to Councillor Settle and then.
I'm very happy with the proposal, but just referring to Councillor Andrews' comments, he seems to be looking for a compromise. He's happy with 9 o'clock, but there are 6 inter-club matches in summer, and he was requesting a 10 p.m. switch off just for those 6 matches. I don't know whether that's acceptable or not.
Again, it's for the committee to decide. My own feeling is I think we have to be careful and we have to consider the needs of the residents. You're going to get lighting right up till 9 o'clock that isn't there at the moment. That's an opportunity. My own feeling is 9 o'clock would be sufficient, but that's for you to judge as well. Councillor Nixon.
It was pretty much what Councillor Settle just said, but would there not be a compromise to allow for those 6 into what I would not like to happen is that we, as a planning committee, restrict that club from playing intercontinental matches, interclub matches in, you know, and that they can't use their facility. So is there a compromise somewhere that other than those 6 matches that he says it might be required, that they could just have a limit on 6 matches. They have a 9 p.m. switch off generally, with 6 matches allowed in one particular year for a 10 p.m.
To come in terms of that requirement.
Yeah, I suppose the issue would be one of the starting point is obviously there is no lighting at the moment, and I presume they managed to carry out inter-club matches as things stand with no lighting. But they would be restricted if there was poor light. It is possible. I think if you think back to the bistro at the Winsport Centre, that has got a condition there that says that it should close at a particular time, but that there are a number of occasions when, for special events, it can be open beyond that, and there's a limit and then a requirement to pre-notify the council. It is very much more difficult to ensure that type of control because you have to have a way of counting the 6 events and making sure that there were only 6, etc. So it does detract a little from the enforceability of those conditions. I'm not saying it's not possible, but like I say, it would make it more complicated.
Mark, could I just ask one question? It's just, if we were to approve on the basis of 9 p.m. and ask the club to see how that goes, they could, in time, couldn't they, come back? Remember, they haven't got this at the moment. So they could come back with another application to revise that and perhaps give us evidence of why that is needed rather than just a simple request. Would that not be a way forward, that we're providing them with the lighting that they require, but if they want to go to 10 or 10:30, let's see what they can do with 9 p.m. It might be that they can actually deliver those by rescheduling, and then we've also taken into account the needs of residents as well, rather than just go first, you know, for a late time. Because remember that if you go for 10 o'clock, that also means a lot of activity until 10 o'clock. And, you know, 10 o'clock is significantly later than 9 o'clock in terms of family life. That's what I'm thinking in terms of people living there. I put that. Is there a way forward on that, Mark?
Yeah, that's what I was going to come on to say, actually.
Right, all right.
Anyone can apply to a vary condition. So we could, well, see what it's like now, because there is, quite often it's difficult to go from nothing to something, as opposed to going from something to a little bit more. So actually it would allow the tennis club to assess whether there is actually a need to go any later, and obviously residents will get used to it and will be able to understand that, as the point was made earlier, that you don't just need dark. This doesn't solve the problem of British weather. It only solves problems of British daylight.
Okay, thank you.
May I come in there?
Yes,
and
of
make
course,
a-
fine.
Taking the second point first, there's a requirement for there's also a requirement for licensing at Beachcomber, so there's double enforcement there, and they have to come to us ahead of time. Like I say, it just makes it more. It puts more burden on the team to monitor that. That's the main thing. If the condition was amended, I would do it similar to what the Vice Chairman has said, but I perhaps wouldn't bother with the dates. Just have it on 6 occasions. Because if you're doing 6 occasions during the summer, it might well be that you don't need it anyway, due to.
I mean, I'm going to go back to Councillor Armitt's, the 10 o'clock. Where are we on that? Because we need to get a view whether that is something that, or we can stick to the recommendations, but then say to the club, well, see how you go, if you want to come back with a revised application, but they may be able to work within the 9 o'clock.
So see if we've got a seconder for Councillor.
Yes, yeah.
I said I'd second it on the 9 o'clock.
Original proposal, which was, and I actually feel the right way, this is my guide, you don't have to listen to it, but would be to go with a proposal for 9 p.m, but also, you know, if they want to come back with evidence that they require that, I would feel happier in terms of reassuring residents that they. I would say they are able to play matches up until 9 p.m. See if they can reschedule and work that. They can play. Yes, they can play until 9 o'clock. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So just to confirm.
Yeah.
So the condition requires the lights to be turned off at 9 p.m. Doesn't require play to stop at 9 p.m.
Yes.
So if there is sufficient light, play could continue.
We're not giving them any 6 days a year.
So that, I think, I just wanted to double check in terms of who proposed the 9 PM, and I think Councillor Griffiths seconded it, but was there a proposal for the 9?
Councillor Army proposed 10 PM. Did you not propose it? I thought you did.
We do have a proposer.
Oh.
We've got a second. We've got Councillor Farrington to propose.
I was just going to suggest before we do that, on that condition 4, we just added underneath it that the club could apply for an extension up to 10 PM on 6 various occasions. So it doesn't give them the opportunity to just do it, they just apply for an extension on 6 occasions.
Just to come back on that, Chairman, there is a provision to do that anyway, so,
Yeah. So
so
we can
that'll
just
be a
make that clear.
an application to vary
We
it.
can-
So I would say,
Yeah.
do not complicate it,
No,
keep
no,
it simple.
no.
So if we vote on the
Yeah.
9 PM, obviously there's still an opportunity
so.
to consider a further amendment to that, but
Yeah. So all those in favour, we're voting to support this proposal, but with a 9 PM curfew on that. All those in favour, please raise your hands. Thank you. That's unanimous. Thank you. Got there in the end. Okay. If you have looked, well, I'm sure you will have, but there's an information item right at the back of your report, which is to do with the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act and consequential revisions to the National Planning Policy Framework. This is we're not planning to spend, we are going to plan some training in this area for you, which is important, possibly for parish and town councils as well. But we had a conversation yesterday, and Mark is willing to give a very short presentation, 10 to 15 minutes, just go through the salient points of what we have in front of us. And I'm sure you've looked at some of these, because some are significant and some are more dependent on secondary legislation, so perhaps won't have any impact immediately. But I thought, as we're together and we're still before 12:30, which isn't necessarily a cut-off point, but it's a reasonable, I think, if you're happy with that, to spend about a quarter of an hour perhaps just going through some points that Mark will make. And then when it comes to the full training, you'll have a little bit more understanding maybe of the context. Okay, Mark, thank you.
thank you, Chairman. So that paper relates to 2 issues. One is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act, sometimes referred to these days as LURA, and the National Planning Policy Framework. So looking at the Act changes first. It is primary legislation. It's an Act of Parliament, and much of what it does is it effectively creates the scaffolding to hand secondary legislation from that. A lot of the detail will be in that secondary legislation. So at the moment, it's these provisions will come forward, but how they will operate, what they mean, that will be defined later on. But what generally happens is government go out to consultation on that secondary legislation and guidance, etc., and how it's implemented. So a lot of the detail will come forward. So it's a direction of travel rather than some of the detail in this particular part. It may well. That is the Act. The Act is there. The secondary legislation that comes out of it, I suppose, you could have a new government that decided it wasn't going to continue down that line. I think it is fair to say, though, that both main political parties are proposing changes to the planning system, one way or another. So we'll see how much it watch this space. I couldn't say that I've actually looked in detail at the breakdown of the voting on this, but I think it's clear that a number of elements of this might be taken in a different direction, but that the framework in some elements could still be utilised, even if the secondary legislation could use the primary legislation, but go in a different direction, shall we say? But yeah, it's hard to crystal ball gaze on that one. So development management changes, which were some of the principal issues that this committee looked at. So we've got an introduction of national development management policies. So like the national planning policy framework that we keep referring to, that is a material consideration in determining our planning application. But these new national development management policies would actually have the same weight as the local plan policies. So they would have what you call development plan weight. And if there was a contradiction between a local policy and the national policy would take precedence. So that is a significant change in the positioning of national policy. The original intention, I think, of the framework was to have it as development plan policy, but it wasn't done in that way. And when it went to a legal challenge, the government lost. The government of the day lost. So I think they've learned from the mistakes of that by making it clear at this stage.
That's taking away local, isn't it?
Yeah, so the idea of national development management policies will be, the principle behind it is lots of development plans, local plans, have the same policy repeated. We have a policy that looks at ensuring that materials are appropriate to the area, as does Wyre, as does everywhere else. The idea is, rather than having each policy different, you have one policy, covers everything, saves time at examination because it's just the national policy. There is guidance that's suggesting that you wouldn't repeat a national policy or seek to divert from it. So it does make it on a more national level. Some of those will be relatively uncontroversial. Others will probably be more controversial. But yeah, again, we'll have to wait and see what the consultation brings. The other key change, and this is something that this committee has looked at in the past, is a community infrastructure levy. We paused pending the new arrangements, and this Act contains the new arrangements, but secondary legislation would have the details of those new arrangements. But the clear direction of travel at the moment is it an infrastructure would replace SIL and Section 106 agreements. Previously, it was suggested it would be more of a hybrid arrangement, but there's a move to that. And that finally, my favourite joke, that planning permission should be granted by phone and a voting line, appears to have come to pass, and that basically a street can decide whether planning permission is granted for different forms of development. So the idea would be that you'd have a local development order at a very small scale that a local community could establish. It colloquially referred to as street vote. I presume there could be a village vote or whatever, but that's the idea. So
that was my question on that. So is there a definition? So you take Clifton Drive, or what's it, Android East, or what's the definition of the street?
yeah, so this one is something that there is some consultation on at the moment, and the suggestion there is there should be a minimum of 10 properties to constitute a street. None. So
It could still be thousands. It could be much more complicated.
it could, or it could be part of a street. Street vote is the colloquial cover.
Of course, I'll vote for your extension if you give me 100 quid.
So the street vote, did you say the street vote disagrees with the national policy? How's that going to work?
There's some suggestion in the consultation that they would have to meet national policy.
So
But,
the street vote's not going to be relevant one way or another? Is it
well,
just to make national policy?
so I think this is really about residential extensions primarily. So you could have greater permitted development rights in a particular street. That would be wonderful to administer from our point of view, working out.
Don't you mean that?
Yeah,
The only street in Canada, 1,000 miles long.
yeah, that's right. I mean, the suggestion at the moment is, I think, is that yeah, as framed, it could go up to 7-storey extensions.
It's watch this space, isn't it?
Yeah.
really?
So yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, Another one that's more, this again in leveling up. Planning enforcement. There's quite a lot of changes to planning enforcement. So at the moment, if you've got a building that's you get away with, for want of a better term, for 4 years as a breach, then it becomes immune from enforcement. But a use is 10 years. So there's provision to make it all 10 years. So basically, it makes it much simpler. A lot of time at planning appeals, enforcement appeals, is spent arguing whether it's a 10-year breach or a 4-year breach. So that will avoid that.
Will any of this come in retrospective?
I'm not too sure. I know quite often there'll be a some form of provision that will cut it off.
So if you're 3 years into a 4-year breach now, it's not
Yeah,
gonna get
yeah.
to the-
That again, that will come from the secondary legislation. But the suggestion would be that there would have to be some form of, like, say, if you the way you do this is applying for a certificate of lawfulness at 4 years and 1 day, for example. So it's on the date that you would submit it. So it could well say that that's that's the limit, as it were. It would apply retrospectively, but not necessarily retrospectively. There's something that already had the 4-year exemption. I suspect we'll get lots of applications as a result of this, but let's see. We can offer issue temporary stop notices, and that only stops development for 28 days whilst you consider whether to serve a full stop notice. Those were very much introduced as part of legislation to look at travellers, really. So that's extended to 56 days. And there's also provision to introduce a stop notice for listed buildings as well. So a temporary stop notice for listed buildings. Stop notices themselves, as opposed to temporary ones, come with a risk of having to pay compensation. So the temporary stop notice removes or reduces that risk. So that's that. The next thing is a new enforcement warning notice. So that's basically at the moment we write to many people and say to people, you are in breach of planning. That doesn't really have any formal status unless you move it forward to an enforcement notice. So this provision is to actually make a more formal notice. So you can write to people. It would stop the clock in regard to that 10-year period. So that letter would be considered to be formal part of the enforcement toolkit. Quite a lot of time people say, this council doesn't take enough enforcement action when we actually are taking action. So actually this resolution will be another sort of arrow in the quiver of enforcement, I suppose. Moving on. Sorry, go on.
So you take TR10, for example, they promised us that the surrounding stuff would be gone by the 2nd of December, so it wouldn't impact Christmas. Obviously, they just said that, and nothing happened at all. Sat down with them, met with them, that's what they said. It's still there, not like it's moved to the short term. I don't know if that's a breach of anything, because they just said it. I don't know if it's a rule. And do they get, can we find like 1,000 a day or something? Or what's the motivation for anybody to obey a rule?
There's no control over that from a planning point of view. The only planning controls you've got over development of that nature is when they start, the 3 or 5 year condition that you've got to start the development. But once you start, you can carry on. There is something called a completion notice that you can serve, but that basically says, as of this day, or that has to be 12 months hence, your development is complete, so you end up with half-built building. It doesn't actually require them to complete it. It just says the stage you've got at is complete, is considered to be complete, and you can't carry on and finish it off. So that doesn't help that issue that you're raising there. That the closure of the road, etc., that's all done as a road closure through the county council. So in terms of the cost of that, etc., I don't know how that operates in terms of that. But at the moment, I suppose there isn't a sort of a day-by-day clause I suppose the main issue will be the longer it takes to build, the more it costs the developer.
Anything a developer says to us then doesn't have any weight whatsoever.
Not in regard to those issues that you've raised. Obviously, if there's a planning condition saying that something needs to be done, then
The public needs to know that, 'cause the public sits down with the developer, trust what's being said, and it's all just baloney.
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to defend the developer, any individual developer, but of course the developer could just say that was our plan. Plans change.
And sometimes, perhaps infrequently or less frequently than we would like, developers say something and they do it.
Is that an issue? Give us an example.
But they do, they're pretty close to it, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's a good example, actually. Yeah.
The
The Moss Road was supposed to be funded in about 10 years' time. It'll be open and not too distant. It's well ahead.
Third election, hard that photo on that promising, sure.
But it's still coming in earlier.
Anyway,
than it was
yeah.
anticipated, yeah.
So, right. Anyway, moving on. Another thing that people do with enforcement is they take all the opportunities they can to appeal just to extend the period of time. So, probably related to the point that Councillor Hammett makes, dragging things out. So you can appeal against it. So they can say, "Oh, I'll submit a retrospective application, get it refused, appeal against that. Council serves an enforcement notice. You can appeal against that." So you just drag it out. So provisions for only one enforcement appeal. Also, the scale of penalties for breaches of conditions and Section 215 notices. 215 notices are untidy land notices. Those have all been proposed to be increased. And the last point there, I don't think that's very often comes up, and that's just that if there's a national defence or civil emergency provisions that the government can sort of say, actually, you don't need to comply with those conditions for this period. I don't know, say there was a condition requiring a sports centre not to be used after a certain time, going back to what we were discussing earlier, and it was being used as a flood accommodation or something like that, then it would be suspended. So that's that. A lot of that, we'll see what comes out in the secondary legislation. The National Planning Policy Framework, that was updated again in December 2023. There are further consultations on further amendments. The December 2023 change is not to be mistaken for the September 2023 change that also took place. But anyway, so this is a bit more significant than the earlier 2023 amendment. So basically, from a plan making perspective, there's a greater emphasis on local plans. These obviously policy, going back to previous discussions today, this stuff falls to the executive, but it's obviously clearly of interest to this committee. It removes the requirement for an annual update to the 5-year housing land supply to be done on a yearly basis if your local plan is less than 5 years old and considered as housing supply as part of its approval. We say ours did, so it's still within that 5-year period. However, from a monitoring point of view, we'll continue to produce a 5-year supply anyway. In that supply, there were some buffers that were applied for certain circumstances, and those are now removed. So basically, the 5-year supply was never a 5-year supply; it was 5 years plus a bit more. So, so those buffers are now removed, and actually is to our benefit in demonstrating that 5-year supply. But going back to that debate earlier, there's even greater emphasis on ensuring that the needs of older people are met. So that'll be people 55 and over still, Tim, I'm afraid. I fall into that category as well. I feel your pain. So, so yeah, so that's that. There's a lot of debate as this stuff came forward about neighbourhood plans. This isn't really relevant to us at the moment because none of our neighbourhood plans have got a housing allocation. But had they got a housing allocation, they would get greater protection from non-plan compliant housing provisions. But neither the Sentans or the Browning-Wharton plans include allocations, and therefore this doesn't really benefit that. Previously, requirements to review Greenbelt as part of the plan formulation. There's now no longer a requirement to do that. Like I say, we've only just done ours, so again, that's probably lesser in the immediate future for us. And then entry-level housing. So this is things like affordable housing for starter homes, that type of thing in the rural areas in particular. That's now referred to as community-led development. But community-led development can be more than housing. So so it can be non-residential proposals as well. So yes, that's a change in emphasis there. It could be shops, could be community centre, it could be a business, a community business. Yeah. So,
In terms of buffers and things, just
Mhm.
when we did the 76-person care home, does that count as 76 homes?
no, but it is formulaic assessment. I can't remember what you apply a percentage. It is actually quite advantageous to us when we've done the maths. When you actually sort of say how many houses would have been built on that site, usually if you build a care home, you end up with a bigger contribution towards your housing number. Yeah, because those are self-contained behind their own front door. Yeah. And then again, this is something that I thought we already did, but agricultural land quality and availability assessments are an important element of assessing whether a site should be allocated for alternative development when you're making a plan. That's more of the plan making side, but going back to the development management stuff, an issue about density, significant uplifts in density, if they're out of character with an area, then there's guidance to sort of say that shouldn't be allowed. This is probably more relevant to more densely packed urban areas where there's more of a higher housing requirement and people are trying to get as much development on a small site as possible. I know we've had a bit of a debate about Lytham today and densities, but let's face it, the character of Lytham is a densely populated area. You probably there you're looking at these situations whereby you get in a suburban area, maybe somewhere in St Anne's perhaps, which is more suburban, with proposals to put more houses in if you got a single house with a big garden, to increase the density of that. But that would all be followed through in local design codes. There's a more emphasis on developing local design codes, so that's some work that we have been progressing this, but we'll have to progress it further, to say what's important in the local area, identify what is the local character of the area, etc. So it sets out, it doesn't tell people how they should develop a site, but it says what is important locally, and how that, if you follow a design protocol which is following that design code, you should get a development that is in keeping with the character of the area. Next thing is to require planning conditions to be better identified, the approved plans, which is something we always do anyway. I think you'll see from the agenda we set out these are the approved plans. That's what we do already as a standard practice, but that's find its way into the framework. And then there is weight given to supporting low carbon heating in existing premises. Just that additional note at the bottom there is just an additional note from me because it was raised as a question at a committee recently, and that is that there was a written ministerial statement recently that reinforced that planning policies should not seek to extend the requirements of building regulations when it comes to non-carbon heating, non-carbon energy, requiring additional levels of insulation. So basically,
That's just for green, isn't it? Because that's what we've argued here before. So we're saying here about not being able to enforce charging points, not being able to enforce solar, not being able to enforce water collection, and anything that's vaguely green, the government's saying, nope, not interested.
yeah, I mean, what they are saying, I suppose, is that those are dealt with by other means other than planning. Whether those standards are sufficient or not is obviously open to much debate. But I suppose at the end of the day, there is an election coming, so that's where it'll be debated.
Next week.
So anyway, that was a very quick canter through the main points. The ones I've sort of tried to pull out primarily to, in case there is applications in the pipeline that might be of relevance. But the plan is to do some more formal training. I think the stuff on the Act will have to wait until we know a bit more about what is proposed. There might be some subject areas which we can cover rather than covering it as a wider topic, but certainly in regards to the framework, again, what the framework says and what it means are quite often two different things, and it gets it gets interpreted differently. So again, this is relatively fresh, so it'll be being clarified with some further guidance in the national practice. The actual national planning practice guidance will say how it's expected that these framework statements are interpreted. So again, we'll do some more training outside the committee forum.
Mark, should that training therefore, given what we discussed before, include all the scrutiny people? Because if they're going to be making the decision on it, don't know what they're talking about, then it would be good to get them trained.
Yep, so the training that we've done so far has been made available to scrutiny and the executive members as well. So yeah, that's yeah, in particular the policy stuff, particularly important.
Oh, yes. And before you leave, I think we've got right at the very back of the report, if you've noticed, there are two appeals notices there, decisions, both of which were, well, they were to do with telecommunication masts, and both were dismissed.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
So I think those were both prior determination applications, not planning applications. So we can only take into account certain issues in determining those applications. So they are good ones to win when you effectively got you know, some of the elements of concern that we did have, you can't address. But I think also it addresses the issue that just banging telecoms masts every few hundred yards down the road is not an appropriate response. I think we'll see more of that with the 5G provision, because they're smaller cells, therefore they need more facilities. So in terms of that, it is permitted development from a planning point of view, and then I think they need to have to get various. That's both the above ground and underground elements of it. It's permitted development. They are a telecommunications operator, so they get that. I think they then have to go through an agreement with the highway authority in terms of the work, but it's more of a license rather than a permission. Certainly, there's nothing from a planning point of view. Whether there is the only control you have from a planning point of view is if the box is above a certain height and it interferes with a visibility display. That has to be more than a metre high. Quite a lot of them aren't. So yeah. So yeah, it's yeah. If you want to watch Netflix, that's what you got to put up with. Yeah, sure. We submitted our objection. I think that's on our website actually. If anyone's seen it, made a number of issues about the lack of information to comment on. Our objection to some of the information, the size of the facility, the substations, etc. The next phase. So that was the formal pre-application stage, which is stage 1 of a 6-step stage. So the next stage will be the submission of the application to the planning inspectorate who will determine the application. That, I understand, is proposed. I can't recall if there are 2 dates in it, and I think the next date is May, when there'll be. I think that's the date of submission, and then they'll be moving forward to July for the 3rd stage. That's again going back to the point. That's their plan, so that is subject to change. I think once it gets to that 2nd stage, the submission of the application to the planning inspectorate, that's when it becomes a bit of a roller coaster in the terms of it's let go and it doesn't stop until it gets back to the end. At the moment, the actual submission date could be put back. But once it's submitted, it becomes very driven by a timetable. that's when it gets quite complicated in terms of, you know, you got very short times to comment on things. So yeah, so that will be the next stage.
So there's nothing else for file?
I expect if I was them as applicants, I will be coming back to file saying what can I do to address your concerns. But like I said, that's the next formal stage, is the submission. So if anything does come back, we obviously established that small group, which includes Councillor Collins, and we'll go back to that group and notify the committee of any moves. Yeah, that's where it stands at the moment.
Okay.